We were taught that civilization has a starting point. A clean line in the sand. A place we can point to on a map and say, this is where it all began. Sumer. Mesopotamia. Around 6,000 years ago. Cities rose, writing appeared, history finally woke up. Everything before that, we're told, was a long, quiet preface. Humanity waiting in the dark. But what if that story is wrong? Not wrong in the sense of being entirely false, but wrong in a more uncomfortable way. Wrong because it is incomplete. Wrong because it is convenient. Wrong because it allows us to believe that complexity, intelligence, and meaning suddenly appeared, rather than slowly accumulating across tens of thousands of forgotten years. Imagine standing at the edge of time, looking backward, and realizing the ground beneath your feet is not solid bedrock, but carefully arranged stepping stones. Stones placed by modern assumptions, colonial archaeology, and a deep human desire for simple beginnings. Sumer feels safe as a starting point because it gives us order. It gives us a story with a clear first chapter. But real history is rarely that kind. If civilization truly began only with cities and writing, then everything before them must have been silence. And yet, silence leaves no monuments, no kings' names, no laws carved into stone. Silence is easy to ignore. Silence cannot argue back. But the past before Sumer was not silent. It was simply speaking in a language we forgot how to hear. Long before the first brick was laid in Mesopotamia, humans had already crossed continents, survived ice ages, mastered fire, shaped stone with astonishing precision, and told stories that lasted longer than any empire. They organized themselves, remembered their dead, honored the sky, feared the unseen, and passed knowledge across generations without a single written word. That is not the behavior of a species waiting for civilization. That is civilization unfolding in a different form. The idea that history begins with writing is not an objective truth. It is a bias. Writing preserves power, not people. It records debts, laws, ownership, and authority. It remembers rulers far better than it remembers mothers, hunters, children, or the thousands of unnamed hands that made survival possible. When we define civilization by writing, we automatically erase everyone who lived successfully without it. And that erasure is enormous. By the time the first Sumerian tablets were pressed into clay, humans had already existed for over 200,000 years. For more than 95% of our story, we lived without cities, without kings, without borders drawn on maps. If those lives do not count as civilization, then we are left with a troubling implication, that most of humanity lived without meaning, structure, or intelligence. Deep down, we know that cannot be true. The truth is more unsettling. Civilization may not be something that suddenly appeared. It may be something that slowly trapped us. To question the beginning of civilization is not just an academic exercise. It forces us to question why we live the way we do now. Because if civilization emerged gradually, through choices rather than destiny, then our modern world is not inevitable. It is inherited. And inheritances can be re-examined. Before Sumer, humans already understood time. They tracked seasons, migrations, the movement of stars. They understood cause and effect in ways that meant life or death. A failed hunt, a late winter, a misjudged river crossing could erase an entire group. Survival demanded memory, planning, cooperation, and restraint. These are not primitive instincts. They are complex social skills refined over millennia. The image of early humans as barely conscious brutes is not based on evidence. It is based on discomfort. Because acknowledging their sophistication forces us to accept that intelligence does not require skyscrapers, and meaning does not require monuments. What archaeology often shows us are fragments, broken tools, scattered bones, faint traces of hearths. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Organic materials decay. Wood rots. Skin, fiber, and voice disappear. Entire worlds vanish without leaving ruins. A culture that builds in stone survives the record. A culture that builds in memory does not. So we mistake endurance for importance. The real question is not when civilization began, but why we define it the way we do. Why do we privilege permanence over adaptability? Why do we equate progress with control? Why do we assume that settling down was an improvement rather than a trade-off? Because once humans stopped moving, everything changed. But that comes later. To understand what existed before Sumer, we must let go of the idea that history is a ladder, with each rung objectively better than the last. Human societies did not march forward in a straight line toward cities and states. They explored possibilities. Some paths led to agriculture. Others did not. Some groups settled permanently. Others chose mobility, flexibility, and balance with their environments. And many of those choices worked. For a very long time. The world of 20,000 BC was not empty wilderness waiting to be conquered. It was already mapped in the human mind. Rivers had names. Mountains had stories. Animals were not resources, but neighbors, rivals, and teachers. Knowledge was embedded in landscape, carried in ritual, encoded in song and movement. Lose the song, and you lose the map. This kind of knowledge does not fossilize well. When we say, before civilization, what we often mean is, before hierarchy. Before centralized power. Before surplus could be hoarded, taxed, or defended by force. Civilization, as it is usually defined, coincides almost perfectly with inequality. That should give us pause. The earliest cities did not emerge because humans suddenly became smarter. They emerged because conditions forced new solutions. Climate shifts, population pressures, and environmental instability pushed humans into tighter spaces, denser communities, and more rigid systems. Cities were not a triumph of enlightenment. They were an adaptation to stress. And like all adaptations, they came with costs. But standing at the threshold of Sumer, we often look backward with condescension. We imagine chaos giving way to order, ignorance yielding to knowledge. What if the opposite is closer to the truth? What if something was lost as much as something was gained? Before the first kings ruled, no one owned the horizon. Before laws were written, rules were negotiated face to face. Before time was measured in labor, it was measured in light, hunger, and rest. Life was harder in many ways, yes. But it was also immediate. Tangible. Grounded in relationships rather than abstractions. This does not mean the past was a paradise. It was brutal, uncertain, and often short. But it was not empty of culture, structure, or thought. It was not waiting to become civilized. It already was, just not in a way that flatters modern sensibilities. The danger of believing in a single point of origin is that it blinds us to continuity. It turns a long human story into a short one. It makes us forget that every brick city stands on an invisible foundation of tens of thousands of years of experimentation, failure, memory, and resilience. Sumer did not invent civilization from nothing. It inherited it. Distorted it. Formalized it. And then recorded its own version of events, which survived long enough to convince us it was the beginning. But beginnings are often written by those who arrive last. To trace the true age of human civilization, we must be willing to walk backward into uncertainty. Into periods without names. Into times that left no chronicles, only traces. We must listen not just to what the past preserved, but to what it was never able to keep. Because somewhere in that vast stretch of unrecorded time, long before the first city walls rose, humans were already asking the same questions we ask now. Who are we? What matters? How do we survive together? What do we owe the dead? What do we fear in the dark? Civilization did not begin when those questions were first written down. It began when they were first asked. And that moment is far older than we are comfortable admitting. The world 20,000 years ago was a place shaped by extremes. Ice sheets, miles thick, pressed down on entire continents, sculpting mountains, diverting rivers, and freezing vast swaths of land into uninhabitable white deserts. Europe, North America, and Asia were dominated by glaciers so immense that they could crush entire landscapes under their weight. In that era, the planet was colder than it has been for tens of thousands of years, a climate so unforgiving that survival was a constant negotiation with nature itself. The seas were lower, coastlines extended far beyond their modern boundaries, and deserts sprawled where fertile valleys now flourish. Humanity's home was a fractured world of frozen tundras, harsh steppes, and deep forests, punctuated by volcanic mountains and raging rivers. Every step forward demanded calculation, every meal demanded ingenuity, every moment demanded attention. To live then was to live with danger-pressed clothes. Humans were not merely surviving, they were thriving in this extreme. But thriving did not look like what we imagine today. There were no permanent villages, no stone cities, no towering monuments. The homes of these people were mobile, tents, lean-tos, caves. They were intimately connected to the rhythms of the land, following animal migrations and seasonal growth patterns. Every journey was purposeful, every path etched into memory. The hunter-gatherers of this time were both explorers and cartographers, mapping vast territories not with paper, but with intimate knowledge of landscape, wind, and animal behavior. Rivers were highways, mountains were landmarks, and forests were libraries filled with knowledge of edible plants, medicinal roots, and tracking signs of prey. These people moved through their world with a precision that modern humans, bound by maps and GPS, often fail to grasp. Their survival required more than physical strength, it required intelligence, foresight, and constant observation. The climate of the last ice age dictated not just where humans could live, but how they lived. Harsh winters demanded fire mastery, clothing from hides, and tools capable of processing food in ways that could last weeks. Each animal hunted was not only sustenance but material for clothing, tools, and shelter. Meat, bones, sinews, and skins were used with meticulous care. Fire was life itself, a fragile flame that protected against cold, predators, and darkness. But it was also social. Gathering around a fire allowed for storytelling, planning, and the passing of knowledge. The heat of a hearth became the center of a community, however small, and a stage for the earliest human reflections. Light and warmth shaped both survival and culture, creating a world where technology, society, and imagination were inseparable from the natural environment. These humans were not passive in the face of their surroundings. They actively shaped the land in small, deliberate ways. Hearths were built, pathways marked, temporary enclosures made to trap animals. The first experiments with tools and strategies show a species not merely reacting, but anticipating. Spears were crafted for hunting large game, stone blades for cutting, and needles for sewing hides into clothing fit for sub-zero temperatures. The sophistication of these tools reveals a depth of planning and creativity that challenges the stereotype of primitive ignorance. Each artifact speaks of problem-solving under pressure and a mind attuned to subtle details. Survival was a constant puzzle, and humans became master solvers, learning from mistakes, observing patterns, and adapting strategies across generations. The environment was filled with predators, both human and non-human. Wolves, cave lions, and bears competed for territory and resources. Humans hunted these predators, avoided them, and sometimes worshipped or feared them in equal measure. They understood the delicate balance of ecosystems and the risks of overreaching. Their knowledge of animal behavior was profound, knowing where herds would migrate, how seasons affected breeding cycles, and when certain animals were vulnerable. This expertise was not theoretical, it was essential for survival. Death was immediate and often public, a constant reminder of the stakes. Every hunt carried the possibility of failure, every journey the possibility of exposure, starvation, or injury. Life existed on the knife edge of risk, and those who survived were rewarded not only with sustenance but with the validation of skill, foresight, and endurance. Human social life was complex even in the absence of cities. Groups ranged from a dozen to a few dozen people, often extended families or closely linked communities. Cooperation was vital. Every individual had roles: scouts, hunters, gatherers, toolmakers, and caregivers. Knowledge had to be shared carefully, memory was communal, and storytelling preserved the lessons of experience. These were not isolated humans but interconnected communities, communicating across vast distances through patterns, signs, and possibly early symbolic gestures. Language, though unrecorded, was rich and nuanced, carrying not only information but culture, belief, and emotion. Relationships were intense, forged under pressure, and every bond had a direct impact on survival. Social cohesion was not optional, it was life-saving. Yet the world was also magnificent. Ice-carved valleys, frozen rivers glinting in low winter sunlight, auroras painting the sky, and forests thick with life, all of it demanding reverence. Humans did not merely navigate this world, they were witnesses to its beauty and terror. These landscapes inspired what may have been the earliest art: carvings, figurines, and cave paintings depicting animals, people, and abstract patterns. Art was not leisure, it was a record, a ritual, and a meditation on existence. Every line and symbol was a dialogue with the world, an attempt to understand, communicate, and perhaps influence it. Even in the harshest winters, humans found meaning and expression. The cognitive and emotional life of humans in this era was as rich as our own. Fear, hope, grief, joy, and curiosity shaped behavior as much as environmental necessity. Death was omnipresent, yet humans mourned, remembered, and perhaps even anticipated the unknown beyond life. Communities may have engaged in ritualized behaviors, marking seasons, commemorating ancestors, or seeking favor from forces they could not control. The human mind was not merely surviving, it was interpreting, questioning, and imagining. This mental landscape was as intricate as any city, as organized as any early state, though invisible to the archaeological eye. Migration patterns reveal an extraordinary understanding of geography and climate. Humans moved with the seasons, tracking herds across frozen plains, following rivers to the sea, or retreating to sheltered valleys in winter. These movements were deliberate and repeatable, allowing knowledge to accumulate over generations. Each journey was an education, each survival a testament to skill, observation, and ingenuity. Maps existed, but they were mental, woven into story, song, and ritual. Landscapes were encoded in memory as much as in bones or tools. Survival was both a practical and intellectual exercise, demanding creativity and foresight. Even the tools of survival demonstrate human ingenuity at a scale we rarely recognize. Spears, atlatls, fishing hooks, and nets reveal experimentation, iteration, and innovation. Clothing adapted to cold climates, shelters resisted wind and snow, and fires were controlled with precision. Humans were designers, engineers, and scientists, constantly testing and refining techniques. Their achievements were cumulative, building on the experience of countless generations, yet they left few traces visible to the untrained eye. What survives is fragmentary, often enigmatic, yet it hints at a world of extraordinary competence. The physical world shaped humans as profoundly as humans shaped it. Harsh winters forged endurance, cooperation, and ingenuity. Scarcity encouraged efficiency and invention. Predation taught vigilance, strategy, and empathy for the group. Movement across vast, often hostile landscapes cultivated spatial intelligence, memory, and awareness of natural cycles. Humans of 20,000 years ago were not the brutish cave-dwellers of imagination, they were finely tuned organisms living in a finely tuned environment, capable of perceiving and responding to dangers and opportunities with a sophistication that rivals any modern calculation. This was a world of contrasts, brutal yet beautiful, terrifying yet awe-inspiring, fleeting yet eternal in memory and ritual. Humans lived within these contradictions, crafting lives of resilience, intelligence, and culture. To survive was to adapt constantly, to see the world clearly, to respect its dangers, and to find meaning in its rhythms. Every day was a negotiation, every decision consequential. And in this crucible, human society, culture, and cognition were being shaped in ways that laid the groundwork for everything that would come after. In this frozen, windswept, luminous world, civilization had not yet appeared in the form we recognize, but the conditions for its eventual emergence were being set. Minds were being trained, bodies strengthened, social bonds forged, and culture developed, layer upon layer, across generations. The story of human ingenuity, endurance, and observation is inseparable from the environment itself, and to understand the world before Sumer, we must first inhabit it in imagination, as they did, moving through ice, fire, and wind, guided by knowledge, instinct, and an unspoken, unbroken human curiosity that stretches across tens of thousands of years. Around a fire, the world begins to take shape in a different way. It is no longer just the survival of the body, but the awakening of the mind, the stirring of consciousness, and the quiet construction of meaning. Flames dance and crackle, casting shadows on the cave walls, on the faces of those who sit around it. The warmth is more than physical, it is a focal point for social life, a sanctuary against the cold, a boundary between the known and the terrifying unknown beyond the light. Fire draws humans together, and in that gathering, something remarkable occurs. The first stirrings of culture, ritual, and reflection emerge in ways that are subtle but profound. Humans in this time did not need cities to be social creatures, nor did they need laws to understand morality. Around a fire, they shared knowledge of the land, the seasons, the habits of animals. They taught their young how to track, hunt, and gather, passing information in ways that ensured survival but also created a shared mental map of the world. These exchanges were layered with meaning. A story about a hunt was also a story about cooperation, about courage, about failure, about the dangers and rewards of the human condition. Storytelling was both instruction and entertainment, both practical and emotional. Around the fire, humans learned to understand each other, to anticipate behavior, and to feel empathy for members of their group. They were cultivating social intelligence as much as survival skills, and this intelligence became a foundation for all that would follow. The fire illuminated more than faces, it illuminated imagination. Shadows leapt and merged on the cave walls, shapes shifting with the movement of the flames, and humans began to see patterns, to recognize symbols in the interplay of light and darkness. Perhaps these fleeting forms inspired the first experiments in representation, carvings, ochre patterns, the earliest symbolic gestures. Fire became a tool for the mind as much as for the body, a way to explore abstract thought. The very act of observing the flames could induce reflection, meditation, and a sense of awe, a consciousness of one's place in a vast and indifferent world. In this glow, humans were not only surviving, they were beginning to question, to imagine, to create meaning where none had been explicit before. This period reveals a fundamental human capacity, the ability to turn necessity into ritual. Eating together was more than nourishment, it was a reaffirmation of social bonds. Caring for the injured or the elderly was more than survival strategy, it was a declaration of shared responsibility and empathy. Fire itself became central to ritual, whether in celebration, mourning, or marking the passage of time. The act of maintaining a fire, of feeding it, of keeping it alive through long, harsh nights, was itself symbolic, a physical manifestation of vigilance, continuity, and life. These rituals were fragile but potent, intangible yet powerful. They carried lessons that could survive beyond individual lifespans, embedding culture and morality into daily practice. The psychological effects of fire were profound. Light and warmth create a sense of safety, allowing the human mind to venture beyond immediate threats. With the body momentarily secure, the mind could turn inward or outward, contemplating the unknown, planning for the future, or connecting with others. Around a fire, humans could imagine things beyond immediate survival: the shape of the landscape in winter, the migration of animals, the patterns of the stars overhead. They could speculate, hypothesize, and innovate. The fire extended consciousness, both literally and metaphorically, illuminating possibilities rather than just the present. Language and communication evolved in this crucible. Vocalizations, gestures, and expressions around the fire grew more nuanced. Stories became layered, metaphors developed, and abstract ideas could be conveyed. Humor, teasing, and debate likely emerged as social lubricants, strengthening bonds and refining mental agility. The fire was a classroom, a theater, a council chamber. In its presence, humans learned not just to survive together, but to think together, to solve problems collectively, and to form the first hints of culture that transcended the immediate and tangible. These gatherings were small, intimate, and mobile, yet they laid the foundation for cooperation on a scale that would later enable villages, cities, and states. There was also a spiritual dimension to these fires. They were places where humans confronted mortality and the unknown. Death, disease, and predation were constant threats, and the fire was both shield and symbol. It represented life, continuity, and control over the natural world. Perhaps early humans performed rituals, sang songs, or told stories that honored ancestors or appealed to unseen forces. These practices suggest that the need to explain, to placate, and to engage with the mysteries of existence was present long before temples, priesthoods, or written scripture. In this sense, fire was a teacher, shaping not only survival skills but moral and spiritual sensibilities. It offered a space where humans could experiment with meaning, grapple with fear, and imagine a world beyond immediate perception. Human creativity thrived in this context. Tools were repaired or improved near the fire, ornaments carved from bone or ivory were polished in its glow, and food preparation became both practical and ritualistic. Fire enabled cooking, which transformed diets, improved nutrition, and allowed experimentation with flavors and textures. Cooking itself may have encouraged social cohesion, as shared meals became a platform for communication, cooperation, and cultural transmission. The combination of necessity, invention, and sociality around the fire created a feedback loop. Problem-solving led to tools, which led to new behaviors, which led to greater cognitive complexity. In a very real sense, fire catalyzed culture, and culture in turn reshaped the mind. The sensory experience of fire also played a role in shaping human perception. The flickering light altered the appearance of the world, emphasizing motion, contrast, and depth. Shadows created illusions, suggesting hidden forms and inspiring curiosity or caution. The crackle of burning wood, the scent of smoke, the warmth against chilled skin, all of these sensations reinforced memory and emotional connection. Experiences around the fire were vivid, unforgettable, and laden with meaning. They were stored in memory, retold in stories, and carried across generations. Knowledge was embedded in these sensory experiences, not just in verbal instruction. In this way, fire was both medium and message, teacher and symbol, practical and profound. In such moments, humans began to understand time differently. Night was no longer just the absence of light, it was an opportunity for reflection, planning, and shared experience. The cycles of day and night, season and year, became ingrained in memory, ritual, and cultural practice. By observing firelight, humans learned to measure time, to organize activities, and to coordinate with one another. They began to grasp abstract concepts such as sequence, cause and effect, and the rhythms of nature. These understandings, born from necessity and social life around the fire, were essential stepping stones toward more complex social structures. Even solitude around the fire had significance. A single human tending the flames could think, plan, dream, or meditate. Consciousness expanded, allowing reflection on personal experience and the collective experience of the group. Individuals could weigh risks, evaluate outcomes, and imagine futures. Memory was strengthened, storytelling refined, and problem-solving sharpened. The fire illuminated both the world and the mind, creating a space where humans could develop mental frameworks that extended far beyond immediate survival. It fostered imagination, reasoning, and social cognition, the foundations of culture and civilization itself. The fire, therefore, was not merely a tool, it was a crucible of transformation. It created a space where the practical and the abstract intertwined, where social bonds were tested and strengthened, where emotions were shared and understood, and where the human mind could extend its reach. Around this flickering light, humans began to make sense of the world, to create meaning, to explore possibilities, and to establish the rituals, art, and thought that would eventually crystallize into culture, spirituality, and, ultimately, civilization. In the presence of fire, survival became more than endurance, it became the beginning of reflection, imagination, and shared human experience, shaping both the individual and the collective mind in ways that would resonate across millennia. Deep within the earth, far from the cold and wind above, humans found spaces that were at once protective and mysterious. Caves became more than shelters, they were sanctuaries where the boundary between the tangible and the imagined blurred. These hollowed spaces offered safety from predators and storms, but they also provided a canvas for something far less necessary for survival yet essential for the human spirit: expression. The walls of caves, rough and uneven, became mirrors for human thought, reflection, and ritual. In the flickering light of torches, shadows danced across rock surfaces, creating a dynamic interplay between movement, form, and perception. In such spaces, humans began to experiment with ways to leave traces of themselves, not just as marks of passage, but as manifestations of meaning and reverence. The earliest cave paintings are not merely depictions of animals or scenes of hunting, they are symbolic acts, deliberate choices that convey understanding, intention, and belief. Herds of bison, mammoths, and horses appear across walls with remarkable precision, their forms captured in motion, often exaggerated in ways that suggest an emphasis on vitality, power, or sacred significance. These images are not random, they indicate observation, memory, and abstraction. Humans saw patterns in the world and translated them into visual language, encoding information about prey, migration, or environmental changes. But beyond practical purposes, these images also carry emotion, awe, and possibly ritualistic significance. The act of painting itself may have been as important as the final image, a meditative process that reinforced communal identity, skill, and shared cosmology. Light in the cave was never static. Torches, lamps, and fires created moving illuminations, shadows that stretched and twisted across the stone. Artists must have understood how these variations affected perception, how the same image could appear alive under different lighting. This manipulation of light and shadow suggests not just technical skill, but an awareness of psychology and impact. By choosing where and how to place their art, early humans could create experiences that were immersive, dramatic, and even awe-inspiring. The cave, then, was not just a home or a shelter, it was a stage, a sacred theater where humans explored perception, storytelling, and the limits of imagination. In this way, art became ritual, education, and entertainment, all intertwined in spaces removed from daily survival. The placement of paintings deep inside caves, often in areas difficult to access, suggests intentionality beyond decoration. Humans were willing to carry pigments, tools, and time into these dark, cold recesses, suggesting that the act had significance beyond utility. These deep chambers may have been seen as liminal spaces, thresholds between the ordinary world and the sacred or unknown. Perhaps these paintings were part of rites, meant to influence the success of hunts, honor spirits or ancestors, or mark transitions in life. The effort required to reach these chambers indicates that the process itself, the journey into darkness, was an integral part of the experience. In such moments, humans were not just interacting with the physical world, but with ideas, fears, hopes, and questions that extended beyond immediate survival. Artifacts found alongside cave paintings, such as carved figurines, engraved stones, and decorated tools, reinforce the idea that symbolic expression was widespread and multifaceted. These objects demonstrate that early humans thought in layers: practical, aesthetic, spiritual, and social. A carved animal may have been a teaching tool, a talisman, or a ceremonial object. The lines and curves incised in bone or ivory show deliberate patterning, suggesting that abstraction and representation coexisted. Humans were capable of holding multiple concepts in mind simultaneously: utility, meaning, and beauty, demonstrating cognitive sophistication often underestimated by modern assumptions. The cognitive leap required to envision a representation, to manipulate materials to realize it, and to invest it with significance speaks to a profound depth of intelligence and imagination. Caves also served as repositories of memory and history. Repeated paintings in the same locations over generations suggest continuity, shared narratives, and the transmission of knowledge. Humans were encoding experience, teaching lessons, preserving myths, and perhaps recording environmental observations in ways that could survive the fleeting human lifespan. In this sense, caves were the first libraries, storing knowledge not on paper or clay but in durable spaces marked by intent and repetition. To walk through these chambers is to step into the consciousness of the past, to witness not just forms but ideas, anxieties, and aspirations that resonated across centuries. The walls themselves became silent witnesses, holding the collective memory of the people who touched, painted, and revered them. Sound within the cave may have amplified the experience. Human voices echoing against stone create resonance, perhaps enhancing rituals or storytelling. There is evidence that certain chambers were chosen for their acoustic properties, indicating an awareness of auditory impact. Songs, chants, or spoken narratives could have transformed the cave into a space of communal engagement, where knowledge, emotion, and ritual coalesced. Sound, like light, shaped perception and meaning. Early humans were not passive inhabitants of these spaces, they were active participants in an immersive environment that engaged multiple senses and reinforced both community and cognition. These sacred spaces were also arenas for reflection on mortality, power, and the unknown. Cave art frequently depicts dangerous animals, suggesting both admiration and fear. Images may have served as protective symbols, warnings, or spiritual invocations. Figurines of human forms, sometimes exaggerated or abstracted, indicate self-reflection, social awareness, and possibly religious or ceremonial purposes. Humans confronted their vulnerabilities within these enclosed spaces, transforming fear and uncertainty into acts of creativity and meaning-making. The cave allowed for contemplation, planning, and the rehearsal of ideas in a controlled environment removed from the immediate chaos of survival. The interaction between humans and the natural environment in caves reflects a broader understanding of ecology and adaptation. By choosing certain caves, humans demonstrated knowledge of geology, hydrology, and climate. They understood which spaces would remain habitable through seasons, which would provide insulation, protection from wind and predators, and access to resources. This knowledge, combined with symbolic and ritual activity, illustrates the integration of practical intelligence with cultural and spiritual practice. Humans were not merely responding to their environment, they were interpreting, negotiating, and shaping it through cognition and culture. Cave spaces also fostered community identity and cohesion. Gathering to create art, perform rituals, or share stories reinforced social bonds and established shared values. Participation in these activities may have created hierarchies of skill, spiritual insight, or knowledge, laying the groundwork for more complex social structures in the future. Cooperation was required, materials had to be gathered and transported, and skills had to be taught and preserved. Caves became spaces of collaboration, teaching, and mentorship, where experience could be passed across generations even without writing. These spaces cultivated memory, identity, and continuity, essentials of human civilization in its earliest form. In these dark, silent chambers, humans were simultaneously small and immense. They were vulnerable to the elements, predators, and hunger, yet capable of abstract thought, creativity, and symbolic expression. They translated fear and uncertainty into patterns, images, and rituals. They created meaning in places untouched by sunlight, fashioning narratives that bound communities together and allowed knowledge to persist across generations. The caves, therefore, were laboratories of the human mind, places where perception, imagination, memory, and culture intersected in ways that would echo into the very foundations of civilization. Every brushstroke, engraving, and figurine is a testament to human consciousness reaching beyond immediate survival, exploring ideas, aesthetics, and spirituality that would endure long after the hunters and gatherers themselves had vanished. Through these spaces, we glimpse the sophistication of early humans, their observation, their reasoning, and their capacity for abstract thought. Caves preserve not just images but intentions, questions, and reflections. They reveal humans who were aware of themselves as part of a larger world, capable of wonder, awe, and contemplation. They were not primitive in the sense of simplicity, they were pioneers of thought, architects of imagination, and custodians of meaning. Their lives, though harsh and fleeting in comparison to modern standards, were rich in cognition, culture, and spiritual engagement. The caves were their cathedrals, their libraries, and their stages, where human consciousness expanded, ideas took form, and civilization quietly began, not in cities, but in memory, ritual, and reflection. As the ice began to retreat and the world slowly warmed, humans found themselves in landscapes that were transforming just as rapidly as their societies. Glaciers melted, rivers swelled, and forests expanded into territories that had once been frozen wastelands. The rhythm of the seasons became less extreme in some regions, creating pockets of abundance where once only scarcity had reigned. In these liminal zones, the constant movement dictated by survival started to shift. Humans no longer had to chase prey across frozen expanses every single day, they could linger, observe, experiment, and develop patterns of living that balanced mobility with a newfound stability. This subtle shift in the relationship between humans and the environment would have profound implications for the development of social structures, knowledge, and the very concept of home. Life in these warming landscapes was still perilous. Predators persisted, and environmental changes often created uncertainty rather than comfort. Yet, the emerging patterns of abundance allowed humans to establish seasonal camps that could be revisited annually. These camps became more than temporary shelters, they were repositories of knowledge, memory, and culture. Tools could be stored, materials preserved, and rituals repeated. Familiar sites offered a sense of security, a psychological anchor amidst a world still full of unpredictability. Humans began to recognize that the environment could be understood and anticipated, not just reacted to. This recognition marked the first step toward planning on a scale beyond the immediate hunt or the next night's fire. The establishment of repeated campsites allowed social bonds to deepen in new ways. Extended families and small communities could remain in close proximity for longer periods, strengthening relationships and facilitating the transmission of knowledge. Teaching became more deliberate, and apprenticeships emerged in hunting techniques, tool-making, and survival strategies. Children grew up with repeated exposure to the rhythms and rituals of their community, internalizing social norms and skills in a way that transient movement could not allow. Trust, cooperation, and shared responsibility intensified, creating networks of interdependence that were both practical and emotional. In these semi-permanent spaces, humans began to experience what it meant to belong somewhere, to feel rooted, and to invest in a place beyond immediate survival. The cognitive landscape of these humans expanded alongside their physical environment. With more predictable resources and less constant peril, the mind could explore abstraction, strategy, and foresight. Observation of animal behavior, seasonal growth, and celestial patterns could now be tracked over multiple years. Humans began to notice correlations between the cycles of the moon, the migration of herds, and the timing of plant growth. They could plan hunts with greater precision, store food strategically, and experiment with techniques for preserving or enhancing resources. Knowledge accumulated in memory, passed down orally with increasing sophistication. These humans were developing what could be described as early environmental science, not in the abstract, but embedded in lived experience and necessity. The psychological shift from constant movement to periodic stability also changed how humans perceived risk and time. In fully nomadic life, each day carried immediate stakes. There was no room for speculation or long-term planning beyond the next hunt. In seasonal camps, however, humans could project themselves into the future, anticipate scarcity, and reflect on past experiences with more nuance. This mental expansion enabled experimentation, innovation, and strategic thinking. It was in these moments of relative stillness that early humans began to manipulate their surroundings in ways that were not merely reactive but proactive. They could alter landscapes slightly to facilitate hunting, cultivate select plants, or manage water resources. Such interventions, though small, foreshadowed the more dramatic transformations that agriculture would later bring. Alongside practical considerations, a deeper cultural and emotional evolution unfolded. The act of remaining in one place for extended periods allowed rituals to become more elaborate and enduring. Fires could be maintained continuously, not just lit for immediate warmth or cooking. Ceremonial spaces could be defined, tools or sacred objects stored and revisited, and communal gatherings planned around predictable seasonal events. Songs, stories, and myths could develop layers of complexity, tied to specific places and experiences. Memory became spatial as well as social, with the landscape itself encoded with meaning. A particular grove, river bend, or rock formation might serve as a mnemonic device, a locus for ritual, or a marker for storytelling. Humans were beginning to integrate cognitive, cultural, and environmental knowledge in sophisticated ways. The shift toward longer-term campsites also had implications for social hierarchy and cooperation. In transient societies, leadership was situational, often based on skill, charisma, or experience. In semi-permanent sites, patterns of influence could stabilize over time. Individuals who excelled at organizing hunts, preserving resources, or mediating disputes gained authority that could persist across seasons. Social norms became codified through practice rather than written law, and agreements about sharing, property, or ritual participation could be reinforced through repeated interaction. This is the earliest form of governance, not imposed externally, but arising organically from repeated patterns of cooperation and interdependence. The ability to negotiate, remember obligations, and enforce communal standards became a cornerstone of human organization. Environmental observation during this period also deepened the human understanding of risk and reward. Humans could track animal populations over multiple years, noticing trends and adapting strategies accordingly. They could experiment with plant cultivation, observing growth cycles and soil conditions, even if these experiments were rudimentary by later agricultural standards. These incremental observations represented a shift from reactive subsistence to proactive experimentation, laying cognitive and cultural groundwork for domestication of plants and animals. Knowledge was accumulated, tested, and refined collectively, forming a cumulative intelligence that transcended individual lifespans. The emotional life of humans in these semi-permanent spaces was enriched as well. Longer-term settlement allowed for reflection on mortality, loss, and social bonds. Burial practices may have become more deliberate, commemorating the dead in ways that reinforced group identity and continuity. The presence of repeated ritual spaces indicates that humans were not merely surviving, but cultivating meaning, ethics, and spirituality. Children growing up in such communities would inherit a rich tapestry of knowledge, myth, and shared experience, shaping their understanding of the world and their place within it. In this sense, semi-permanent camps were laboratories of both intellect and emotion, spaces where cognition, sociality, and culture interwove. The subtle tension between mobility and stability in these communities also fostered innovation. Humans had to balance the benefits of lingering with the risks of overdependence on a single locale. Environmental changes, predator movement, and resource depletion remained ever-present threats. These pressures encouraged flexibility in planning, the development of storage techniques, and strategic use of the landscape. Humans learned to optimize their interaction with the environment without overexploiting it, creating a delicate equilibrium that required foresight, cooperation, and adaptability. In doing so, they cultivated mental skills that would become essential in later, more complex societies. Moreover, these early settlements nurtured the beginnings of symbolic culture tied to place. Marks on rocks, arrangement of stones, or early art within these seasonal camps may have carried meaning that was understood collectively. Humans were learning that memory could be externalized, encoded in objects or landscapes, and passed down through generations. Place itself became a repository of identity, memory, and culture. The environment was no longer a neutral backdrop, it became a collaborator in human cognition, shaping thought as much as humans shaped it. Knowledge, ritual, and social norms intertwined with physical space, creating an emergent complexity that would underpin later forms of social organization. In these warming landscapes, humans were discovering that time could be measured not only by the passage of days and nights, but by cycles of resource availability, growth, and movement. They could plan for future scarcity, store surplus, and anticipate environmental challenges. This temporal awareness fostered patience, foresight, and long-term cooperation, qualities essential to the development of complex societies. Humans were no longer solely responding to immediate needs, they were beginning to construct strategies, ethics, and knowledge systems that required thinking beyond the individual moment. In this transitional era, the seeds of civilization were quietly taking root. Semi-permanent settlements, combined with environmental understanding, social cohesion, ritual practice, and cognitive expansion, created conditions in which humans could experiment with more complex forms of living. They began to negotiate with the land, each other, and the unknown forces they sensed around them. The interplay of risk, reward, memory, and creativity forged communities that were resilient, adaptive, and increasingly sophisticated. It was in these subtle shifts, in the slow accumulation of knowledge, ritual, and social complexity, that humanity took some of its earliest steps toward what we would one day call civilization. The transformation from constant movement to measured stillness was not dramatic, but it was profound. Humans were learning that they could inhabit the same spaces repeatedly, that familiarity could be leveraged, and that the future could be imagined. In this crucible, cognition, emotion, and culture intertwined, creating a rich foundation for social innovation. Communities became capable of preserving knowledge, experimenting with new strategies, and developing complex bonds of trust and cooperation. The landscapes of the post-glacial world were both challenge and teacher, shaping humans as much as humans shaped them, and in this delicate negotiation, the very concept of home, memory, and belonging began to emerge for the first time. Long before fields were plowed and granaries built, humans began experimenting with plants in ways that were both tentative and revolutionary. For tens of thousands of years, the relationship between humans and the natural world had been one of observation, adaptation, and survival. People learned which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which could be used for fibers, dyes, or fuel. They understood the seasons, the soils, and the subtle shifts in climate that affected growth. But somewhere along this continuum, humans began to intervene in nature in small but deliberate ways, testing whether seeds could be sown, whether roots could be encouraged to grow, and whether selective cultivation could enhance yield. These were not simple experiments, they were acts that carried enormous consequences. Success meant more food, more security, and the possibility of settlement. Failure meant wasted effort, potential starvation, or the disruption of delicate ecological balances. The stakes were high, and yet humans persisted, drawn by curiosity, necessity, and the glimmering promise of control over their world. The earliest plant experimentation was likely subtle. Humans would have noticed that discarded seeds near campfires, midden piles, or temporary shelters sometimes sprouted into edible shoots. Perhaps they observed that certain berry bushes flourished after repeated use, or that grain scattered along riverbanks could be harvested the following season. These observations required patience and acute attention to cause and effect. Humans had to understand that time and environment worked together, that growth was gradual, and that the land could be coaxed rather than coerced. The knowledge that the natural world could respond to human influence was both empowering and dangerous. It introduced the concept of intentionality in subsistence. Actions taken today could shape resources weeks, months, or even years into the future. Such experimentation carried risks beyond mere failure. Plant cultivation required labor, digging, planting, weeding, and harvesting. Seeds could fail to germinate, or crops could be destroyed by drought, flooding, pests, or disease. Human groups experimenting with plants were therefore taking on uncertainty in a way that hunting and foraging did not always demand. A miscalculation could imperil the community, especially in marginal environments. Yet this willingness to engage with risk also reflects a remarkable cognitive leap. Humans were thinking about delayed reward, about future consequences, about systems larger than themselves. They were beginning to conceptualize their environment not just as a stage for survival, but as a partner that could be influenced, negotiated with, and, eventually, partially controlled. This tentative cultivation also reshaped social behavior. When a patch of wild grain or a cluster of edible roots required tending, cooperation became necessary. Groups had to coordinate labor, share knowledge, and manage access to these resources. Rules and social norms likely emerged around ownership, stewardship, and the timing of harvest. These early forms of collective management prefigured more formalized systems of property, distribution, and governance that would later define sedentary communities. Knowledge became communal, bound to place and practice, and passed down across generations through direct observation, instruction, and ritual. The human mind was becoming adept at long-term planning, at imagining scenarios beyond immediate survival, and at embedding social organization into ecological practices. The cognitive dimension of these activities was profound. Humans had to categorize plants, recognize growth patterns, and anticipate seasonal cycles. They had to distinguish between edible, poisonous, and medicinal species, while also tracking soil fertility, rainfall, and local climate conditions. Memory and observation were sharpened by necessity, but imagination and experimentation were equally essential. Every successful cultivation experiment represented a sophisticated understanding of causality, environment, and temporality. Humans were no longer solely reacting to nature, they were engaging in what could be called early experimentation, laying the groundwork for systematic agriculture long before it would become widespread. Emotion and psychology were equally involved. Cultivating plants required patience, attention, and a willingness to defer gratification. Humans had to trust that their labor would yield results, often without immediate confirmation. There was hope, but also anxiety, and perhaps a sense of awe at the responsiveness of life itself. Success brought satisfaction, increased security, and the possibility of abundance. Failure brought frustration, lessons, and caution. The emotional stakes were intertwined with practical outcomes, shaping not only behavior but the human understanding of effort, consequence, and reward. Early humans were learning to negotiate uncertainty in ways that would define human civilization for millennia. Ritual and symbolism likely accompanied these practices. Plants, with their cycles of growth, reproduction, and decay, may have been imbued with meaning. Early humans may have marked the passage of seasons, celebrated successful growth, or offered portions of harvest to ancestors or spirits. These rituals reinforced communal cohesion, transmitted knowledge, and provided psychological frameworks for understanding the precariousness of life. Plants were not only food, they were symbols, teachers, and participants in the social and spiritual fabric of human existence. Humans were learning that cultivating the land was as much an ethical and cultural act as it was a practical one. The interplay between mobility and emerging settlement patterns was also critical. Humans still moved across landscapes, following herds and seasonal patterns, yet the ability to encourage plant growth introduced a form of semi-permanence. Certain areas could be revisited reliably for resources, offering a stable base within a mobile lifestyle. These proto-settlements allowed knowledge, tools, and social structures to accumulate. Humans could experiment over successive seasons, learning from both success and failure, refining techniques, and sharing innovations within and between groups. The landscape itself became a canvas for human ingenuity, a medium for experimentation that demanded foresight, collaboration, and creativity. Early experimentation with plants also had cascading effects on diet and nutrition. By encouraging certain species, humans could supplement hunting with predictable sources of food, reducing the risk of starvation and increasing dietary diversity. This, in turn, affected population stability, social structures, and even cognitive development. Reliable access to calories freed time for other activities, tool refinement, artistic expression, social organization, and ritual. By shaping the environment in this deliberate way, humans were creating conditions for cultural expansion. Every seed sown was a step toward systems of labor, planning, and knowledge accumulation that would define early civilizations. The implications of these experiments went beyond subsistence. They fostered a sense of agency, demonstrating that humans could influence the natural world in meaningful ways. The realization that deliberate action could yield tangible results encouraged further innovation. Humans began to see patterns in nature not as random chaos, but as systems that could be understood, predicted, and manipulated. This systemic thinking underlies every complex society that would follow. Cultivation became a laboratory for human thought, testing hypotheses about cause and effect, observing outcomes, and refining techniques over time. Each generation contributed to an evolving body of knowledge that extended far beyond immediate survival. This tentative engagement with plants also influenced human perception of time and intergenerational responsibility. Actions taken in one season could have consequences months later, requiring planning, memory, and trust in the continuity of human labor and knowledge. Humans began to conceive of their existence in a longer temporal frame, thinking beyond the immediate hunt or seasonal movement. They were beginning to inhabit a world in which effort could be invested for future gain, a conceptual leap that would shape social organization, morality, and cultural identity. In this sense, early plant cultivation was not just an economic innovation, it was a cognitive revolution, expanding the human mind's capacity for foresight, experimentation, and abstract thought. By engaging with the land in these small, deliberate ways, humans laid the groundwork for agriculture, permanent settlement, and eventually the rise of civilization itself. Yet it is crucial to understand that these early experiments were tentative, fragile, and contingent. They depended on observation, knowledge transmission, and environmental stability. They were risky endeavors in a world still dominated by uncertainty. The willingness to engage with these risks speaks to the ingenuity, patience, and resilience of early humans. They were beginning to see themselves as actors in a world that could be shaped, managed, and negotiated, a perspective that would become central to the trajectory of human civilization. In these early efforts, humans were not merely shaping plants, they were shaping themselves. Cultivation required foresight, cooperation, patience, observation, and creativity. It demanded trust in the environment, trust in others, and trust in time itself. It cultivated mental faculties that would be essential for more complex societies: planning, problem-solving, experimentation, and collective action. The act of planting, tending, and harvesting transformed the human relationship to the world, introducing a form of responsibility and engagement that would echo through millennia. These tentative, fragile steps toward control over nature were both practical and philosophical, marking a profound shift in the way humans understood themselves, their communities, and the possibilities of life in a world that could, at times, seem indifferent or hostile. The first seeds planted by humans were more than food, they were experiments in patience, foresight, and collaboration. They were gestures of hope, defiance, and imagination. They marked the beginning of a new relationship with the natural world, one in which humans could influence outcomes, invest in the future, and create stability where once there had been uncertainty. These early acts of cultivation were not yet full-scale agriculture, nor were they accompanied by cities, rulers, or written laws. But they were a radical departure from pure foraging, signaling the emergence of a worldview in which humans began to conceive of themselves as both participants in and stewards of the environment. In this quiet, deliberate manipulation of the earth, the foundations of civilization were being laid, long before the first cities rose on the horizon. Long before the first wheeled carts rumbled across Mesopotamian plains and long before kings inscribed their names on clay tablets, humans were gathering in the open landscapes of what is now southeastern Turkey, erecting structures that defy everything we once assumed about pre-agricultural societies. These were not settlements in the traditional sense, they were not villages designed for permanent habitation, nor were they fortified cities. They were monumental constructions, deliberately designed and laboriously executed, with purpose and intention that speak to the sophistication of the human mind far earlier than previously imagined. Göbekli Tepe, with its massive stone pillars carved with intricate depictions of animals, symbols, and abstract forms, forces a confrontation with assumptions about the timeline of civilization. Here, humans were constructing meaning on a grand scale, hundreds of generations before Sumer would rise and claim the narrative of first cities. The sheer scale of the effort involved is staggering. Massive limestone pillars, some weighing multiple tons, were quarried, transported, and raised without the aid of metal tools or the wheel. The labor required organization, cooperation, and knowledge of physics, leverage, and engineering principles. Small bands of humans coordinated over years, possibly decades, to create circular enclosures whose function remains enigmatic. These structures were not temporary, they were designed to last, to impress, to evoke awe. They suggest a society capable of mobilizing collective effort toward abstract goals, for reasons that may have been spiritual, ritualistic, or social, but which clearly transcended immediate survival needs. The builders were not responding to necessity alone, they were responding to vision, belief, and shared cultural imperatives. The carvings on the pillars are no less remarkable. Lions, foxes, snakes, birds, and other creatures are rendered with startling clarity and dynamism. The images suggest careful observation, profound familiarity with the local fauna, and perhaps symbolic meanings understood within the community. Humans were encoding knowledge, myth, and ideology in stone. Unlike cave paintings that inhabit hidden spaces, these carvings were public, monumental, and designed to be experienced communally. They were a stage for interaction, a visual language that communicated power, ritual, and identity across generations. In these depictions, we see humans grappling with questions that transcend survival, the nature of life and death, the relationships between species, and perhaps even the cosmos itself. Göbekli Tepe challenges our understanding of social complexity in pre-agricultural societies. Prior to its discovery, most scholars assumed that monumental construction required settled agricultural communities capable of producing food surpluses to free labor for non-subsistence activities. Yet here, humans were constructing massive ritual centers while still subsisting as hunter-gatherers, relying on mobility, wild resources, and seasonal patterns. This inversion of expectations forces a re-evaluation of causality. Perhaps the social and religious cohesion required to build such structures preceded, and even stimulated, the development of agriculture, rather than the other way around. Humans were capable of large-scale cooperation, planning, and shared cultural vision without the administrative infrastructure of cities, taxes, or formalized hierarchies. The labor itself suggests a form of proto-organization, an understanding of logistics, workforce management, and long-term commitment that would later define urban life. The act of constructing Göbekli Tepe was likely as transformative as the final product. Laboring collectively over years, humans would have reinforced social cohesion, transmitted knowledge, and cultivated shared rituals. The construction process required careful planning, coordination, and communication, developing skills that went far beyond hunting and gathering. These were humans capable of abstract thought, envisioning forms that did not yet exist, manipulating materials to achieve desired effects, and sustaining effort over long periods without immediate physical reward. Monumental construction, in this sense, was an act of collective imagination made tangible. It was an experiment in society, cognition, and culture, and its impact would have reverberated across generations. Ritual likely played a central role in the life of Göbekli Tepe. The arrangement of pillars in circles, the deliberate placement of carvings, and the spatial orientation of enclosures suggest symbolic considerations, perhaps aligned with celestial events, seasonal cycles, or mythic narratives. Humans were creating a landscape imbued with meaning, a space where the sacred and communal intertwined. Ceremonies, gatherings, and rites of passage may have taken place here, reinforcing social bonds and cultural identity. These activities were not ephemeral, they were part of a structured, repeated engagement with both the environment and the human community. In this way, Göbekli Tepe functioned as a social and spiritual laboratory, where humans explored cooperation, ritual, and symbolism in ways that would later inform the architecture and culture of cities. The materials themselves reveal the sophistication of the builders. Quarrying limestone, transporting it across uneven terrain, and raising massive monoliths required knowledge of leverage, weight distribution, and possibly scaffolding techniques. Humans were problem-solving on scales that would later be assumed to require formal engineering knowledge. This ingenuity demonstrates that cognitive complexity existed long before the formal trappings of civilization. Humans were capable of envisioning end results, organizing labor, and executing plans with precision, all within the constraints of a pre-agricultural, mobile society. Their minds were operating at a level that modern observers might associate with urban planners or architects, yet they were fully integrated with the rhythms and constraints of the natural world. Göbekli Tepe also reveals an intimate relationship between humans and the symbolic. The carvings suggest narrative, communication, and shared cosmology. They may have encoded myths, ancestral stories, or lessons about the natural world. Humans were externalizing thought and belief into durable forms, creating memory in stone rather than in ephemeral speech. These acts of externalization allowed knowledge to persist beyond the lifespan of any individual, reinforcing continuity, culture, and collective identity. Monumental art was not decorative alone, it was functional in shaping memory, social cohesion, and the perception of reality. It was the first known attempt to make belief, community, and knowledge tangible on a scale that transcended individual experience. The choice to invest so much labor into a structure whose function was largely symbolic challenges assumptions about human priorities. It suggests that, even in a world where survival was never guaranteed, humans were motivated by meaning, curiosity, and shared ideals as much as by necessity. The act of creation itself became an assertion of identity, purpose, and agency. Humans were negotiating with the world in ways that extended beyond immediate survival, asserting presence, establishing continuity, and exploring abstraction. Monumental construction was not merely an economic or social statement, it was a cognitive and cultural assertion of human potential, imagination, and foresight. This site also indicates the complexity of human memory and communication. Coordinating construction over long periods and across multiple generations required accurate transmission of techniques, measurements, and symbolic meaning. Oral tradition, demonstration, and repeated practice must have been highly refined to preserve continuity. Knowledge became cumulative, passed down not just as instruction, but as cultural habit, shared belief, and ritualized practice. The social fabric itself was being woven through collective labor, ritual participation, and engagement with a shared, meaningful environment. Göbekli Tepe exemplifies that humans were capable of constructing intricate systems of collaboration, symbolism, and cognition without agriculture, cities, or writing. Even the spatial arrangement of the site reflects abstract planning. Circular enclosures suggest deliberate design, perhaps reflecting social, spiritual, or cosmological principles. The placement of pillars, the orientation of carvings, and the size of enclosures were intentional decisions, indicating spatial awareness, foresight, and conceptual thinking. Humans were engaging with space as a medium of communication and ritual, manipulating the environment to create experiences that transcended survival needs. These early architects and planners were thinking on scales both temporal and spatial, crafting experiences that integrated social, symbolic, and environmental understanding. In many ways, Göbekli Tepe is a testament to human imagination, foresight, and the capacity for abstraction. It reminds us that monumental expression, cooperative labor, and symbolic thinking were not the products of settled agriculture or urban life, they were possible long before, in mobile communities guided by curiosity, ritual, and collective vision. Humans were capable of seeing beyond immediate necessity, investing time, energy, and skill into projects that would outlast themselves and shape the consciousness of generations. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe is not just a site, it is a declaration of human potential, a window into the minds of people who, long before Sumer or writing, were already building civilization in ways that were intellectual, spiritual, and profoundly human. In the shadow of enormous stone pillars, under the gaze of intricately carved animals and abstract symbols, humans were forging the earliest expressions of social complexity. These gatherings were not casual or incidental, they required planning, cooperation, and an understanding of collective purpose. People coordinated labor, shared knowledge, and upheld shared rituals that bound communities together in ways that transcended immediate survival. The creation of monumental structures like Göbekli Tepe demanded an extraordinary level of social organization, suggesting that humans had developed sophisticated mechanisms for communication, cooperation, and authority long before cities or formal governments emerged. Leadership may have been situational, based on skill, charisma, or knowledge, yet it was real and necessary. The social fabric was being woven from shared labor, ritual participation, and the pursuit of meaning, creating cohesion that allowed humans to undertake feats previously thought impossible for pre-agricultural societies. Ritual and symbolism were central to these social structures. Humans had begun to understand that the physical world could be used to communicate ideas, beliefs, and values, creating a shared language of symbols and actions. Carved animals, abstract shapes, and monumental enclosures served not just as decoration, but as focal points for collective experience, memory, and identity. Participants in rituals would have internalized social norms, ethical frameworks, and cosmological narratives through repeated engagement with these sacred spaces. In this way, the rituals themselves became a mechanism for social cohesion, transmitting knowledge and values across generations without the need for writing. Humans were learning to shape not only the material world, but also the beliefs and behaviors of their communities. The scale and effort required for these rituals indicate a sophisticated understanding of human motivation and group dynamics. Coordinating labor over years, managing resources, and ensuring participation demanded negotiation, communication, and social intelligence. These early societies were experimenting with concepts of responsibility, accountability, and collective investment. Participation in rituals likely reinforced social bonds and created a sense of shared purpose, which was essential for sustaining large-scale projects. Humans were learning that meaning, labor, and community were deeply intertwined, and that shared belief could motivate extraordinary feats of organization and endurance. Symbolism extended beyond the physical into the cognitive and spiritual realms. Animals depicted on pillars, lions, snakes, birds, and other creatures, may have carried mythological, spiritual, or protective significance. Humans were externalizing complex ideas about power, danger, fertility, or transformation into durable forms. These symbolic acts were not ephemeral, they persisted in stone, shaping human perception and thought across generations. They were also relational. Humans understood that symbols could influence emotion, guide behavior, and reinforce social hierarchies. In this sense, ritual and symbolism were tools of both cognition and governance, embedding cultural memory and social norms into tangible forms that could be collectively experienced. The presence of repeated ritual sites across a landscape indicates that these practices were not isolated, but part of a broader cultural network. Humans were moving across regions, carrying knowledge, techniques, and symbolic systems with them. Ritual spaces became nodes in a network of cultural transmission, linking disparate groups through shared practices and beliefs. This facilitated cooperation over larger scales than a single camp or hunting party, creating social networks that could persist despite mobility and environmental uncertainty. Humans were cultivating intergenerational knowledge, social bonds, and collective memory in ways that laid the foundation for later, more complex societies. Humans were also negotiating hierarchy and authority through these practices. Individuals with specialized knowledge about rituals, symbolic meanings, or construction techniques would have held influence within the group. Their expertise granted them a form of soft power, shaping decisions, guiding communal labor, and mediating conflict. Yet authority was likely contingent and flexible, emerging from demonstrated skill and trust rather than formal titles. In this way, early rituals served as a crucible for social experimentation, teaching humans how to cooperate, respect expertise, and maintain cohesion in the absence of formal governance. Leadership and social structure were practiced, tested, and refined within these ceremonial contexts. The cognitive demands of ritual practice were considerable. Humans had to remember sequences of actions, understand symbolic correspondences, and coordinate behavior with others. They had to anticipate reactions, manage group dynamics, and maintain focus over extended periods. Participation in rituals required memory, attention, and emotional regulation, creating a feedback loop in which cognition and social complexity reinforced each other. These practices not only maintained social cohesion but also enhanced mental faculties, preparing humans for increasingly complex forms of collaboration, planning, and innovation. Rituals also provided a framework for understanding mortality, uncertainty, and the natural world. Humans confronted life and death, abundance and scarcity, threat and opportunity, and encoded these experiences into symbolic systems. Through ceremony, myth, and ritualized action, communities could manage fear, create meaning, and establish a sense of order in a world that was often chaotic and unpredictable. Symbolic systems allowed humans to conceptualize forces beyond immediate perception, anticipate outcomes, and negotiate relationships with both the environment and each other. The spiritual dimension of these practices was inseparable from social and cognitive development, shaping behavior, ethics, and culture in profound ways. The social and symbolic complexity emerging in sites like Göbekli Tepe also suggests the beginnings of what we might call proto-religion. Humans were experimenting with the creation of sacred spaces, the codification of symbolic meanings, and the orchestration of collective experience. These proto-religious practices reinforced community cohesion, provided frameworks for morality and ethics, and established continuity across generations. Humans were learning that belief, ritual, and shared purpose could be as powerful as physical force or subsistence strategy in shaping society. The capacity to organize around abstract ideas laid the groundwork for larger-scale cooperation, eventually enabling settlements, trade networks, and complex political structures. The interplay between mobility and monumental ritual is particularly striking. These societies were still largely hunter-gatherers, moving seasonally and relying on wild resources. Yet they were capable of planning, constructing, and maintaining ritual centers that required long-term commitment. This suggests a dual understanding of temporality. Humans balanced immediate survival with investment in long-term communal goals. Ritual practice became a medium for negotiating this balance, teaching patience, foresight, and cooperation. Humans were simultaneously grounded in the realities of the natural world and engaged in abstract conceptualization, a duality that would characterize the emergence of complex civilization. Participation in these rituals likely shaped identity and memory at multiple levels. Individual participants internalized shared narratives, while collective engagement reinforced group cohesion. Knowledge, belief, and practice became encoded in both material forms and human cognition, creating continuity across generations. Ritual acted as a glue, binding people to one another and to their environment, integrating memory, social norms, and cosmological understanding into a coherent system. These early societies were practicing the principles of cultural transmission, cumulative knowledge, and collective identity long before writing or urban administration existed. The social, cognitive, and symbolic achievements of these communities demonstrate that humans were capable of extraordinary complexity without agriculture, writing, or permanent settlements. Monumental construction and ritual practice reveal a species engaged in experimentation, innovation, and abstraction. Humans were testing the limits of cooperation, exploring the boundaries of belief, and negotiating the relationships between individuals, groups, and the environment. In doing so, they were laying the groundwork for social structures, cultural systems, and religious ideas that would persist and evolve over millennia. These early experiments in social complexity, ritual, and proto-religion were not ephemeral curiosities, they were crucibles in which the essential elements of civilization, cooperation, abstraction, and shared meaning, were forged. By studying these practices, we gain insight into the depth of human cognition, imagination, and social intelligence 20,000 years before Sumer. Humans were capable of organizing labor, communicating abstract ideas, and sustaining belief systems that transcended immediate survival. Rituals were not mere superstitions, they were mechanisms for transmitting knowledge, regulating social behavior, and cultivating cooperation on scales that would become essential for the emergence of cities, trade networks, and governance. The monumental and symbolic achievements of these societies illuminate the ways in which humans were shaping both their material and cognitive worlds, creating enduring structures of thought, culture, and social organization that would echo through the ages. Long before the fertile plains of Mesopotamia were dotted with villages, humans were experimenting with the edges of cultivation, cautiously exploring the possibility of shaping the land to their needs. In the shadow of monumental ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe, people had begun to recognize that the environment could respond to human intention. They noticed that certain plants flourished when seeds were scattered near temporary camps, that roots left in the soil sometimes returned as fresh shoots, and that wild grains could be coaxed into denser clusters with repeated attention. These observations were subtle, incremental, and fraught with uncertainty, yet they revealed a profound cognitive shift. Humans were beginning to understand cause and effect over longer timescales, anticipating outcomes beyond immediate survival, and investing labor into experiments whose results might only be realized months or seasons later. These early experiments required careful observation, patience, and coordination. Humans had to track the life cycles of plants, understand soil conditions, and note the effects of climate and seasonality. They were building knowledge not as a single individual but as a collective enterprise, sharing insights across families, clans, and gatherings. The cumulative nature of this knowledge is striking. Each generation could build on the successes and failures of the previous one, refining techniques for seed dispersal, soil management, and selective harvesting. Humans were beginning to approach the natural world not as passive consumers but as active participants, capable of guiding ecological outcomes while still respecting the unpredictability inherent in wild systems. The social implications of these proto-agricultural experiments were significant. Cultivation required coordination and division of labor. Some individuals might have specialized in foraging and collection, while others focused on monitoring plant growth or tending the soil. Knowledge became stratified. Those with expertise in particular plants or techniques gained authority and influence, shaping group decision-making and reinforcing social cohesion. Rules and norms likely emerged around access to cultivated plots, sharing of resources, and timing of harvests. In this way, the seeds of social organization were sown alongside the seeds in the soil, intertwining human ecology with governance, cooperation, and ethical frameworks. Experimenting with plants also demanded cognitive flexibility and long-term planning. Humans had to envision outcomes months or years in advance, accounting for environmental variability, potential pests, and competition with other animals. They were learning to think in temporal scales that extended beyond the immediate day-to-day struggle for survival. This capacity for foresight, risk assessment, and strategic labor allocation is foundational to the eventual development of agriculture and permanent settlement. By engaging in deliberate cultivation, humans were not only reshaping the land, they were reshaping their cognition, social structures, and sense of temporality. Ritual and symbolism remain deeply entwined with these early agricultural practices. Humans likely imbued plants and cycles of growth with spiritual or symbolic significance, linking cultivation to belief systems and communal identity. Certain groves, riverbanks, or clearings may have been considered sacred or protected spaces, and successful harvests could have been celebrated through ceremony. These acts reinforced social cohesion, transmitted ecological knowledge, and provided frameworks for interpreting success, failure, and uncertainty. Agriculture, therefore, was never purely practical, it was also cultural, ethical, and deeply human, entwined with imagination, narrative, and collective consciousness. The environmental dimension of proto-agriculture demanded an intimate knowledge of local ecosystems. Humans had to understand the relationships between soil, water, climate, and animal activity. They observed patterns in plant distribution, noted which areas regenerated naturally, and recognized the impact of repeated human intervention on growth and abundance. This attention to detail reflects a sophisticated ecological intelligence, where humans negotiated with nature rather than dominated it. They learned that intervention could yield reward but also carried risk, requiring careful observation, adaptation, and humility before the complexity of the natural world. Labor investment in early cultivation also had psychological and emotional consequences. Humans engaged in acts that required patience, hope, and trust in the continuity of their community. The success of a planted plot depended not only on individual effort but on collective engagement, creating interdependence and reinforcing social bonds. Humans experienced delayed gratification on unprecedented scales, learning to defer immediate consumption for the promise of future abundance. These practices likely strengthened communal identity, trust, and cooperation, embedding the social and moral foundations necessary for more complex forms of settlement and governance. The transition from symbolic ritual centers to experimental cultivation was not linear or uniform. Some groups continued to rely primarily on hunting and gathering, while others began to invest more heavily in plants, testing boundaries, and expanding knowledge. These experiments were inherently risky. Environmental conditions could change, wild animals could consume or damage crops, and labor invested could fail to produce immediate reward. Yet the very willingness to engage with these risks demonstrates a profound human capacity for abstraction, foresight, and experimentation. Humans were learning to navigate uncertainty through observation, collaboration, and incremental intervention, laying the cognitive and social foundations for agriculture. This period also highlights the feedback loop between ritual, social cohesion, and experimentation. Monumental constructions and collective ceremonies had created networks of cooperation and shared knowledge. These networks facilitated the spread of cultivation techniques, the exchange of ecological insights, and the reinforcement of social norms around resource management. Ritual spaces may have provided occasions to plan, demonstrate, and celebrate agricultural experiments, linking material practice with symbolic meaning. In this way, humans were simultaneously shaping the environment and shaping themselves, integrating cognition, culture, and ecology into a coherent system. The implications of these early experiments are profound. By deliberately interacting with plants and landscapes, humans began to influence population dynamics, settlement patterns, and social organization. They learned to anticipate scarcity, plan for abundance, and balance risk with reward. The knowledge acquired through these practices was cumulative, extending across generations and enabling more ambitious forms of manipulation and construction. In short, humans were beginning to create the conditions for permanent settlement, labor specialization, and the emergence of complex society, long before the formal advent of agriculture as a widespread practice. Emotion, imagination, and ethical considerations were inseparable from these developments. Humans were negotiating responsibility to the land, to one another, and to future generations. Cultivation required stewardship, patience, and moral judgment, as well as practical knowledge. Success reinforced communal bonds and individual status, while failure provided lessons, fostered resilience, and encouraged adaptation. The act of planting, tending, and harvesting became a medium for the transmission of knowledge, social norms, and cultural identity, shaping both the human mind and human society in profound and enduring ways. By examining these early experiments, we see a vision of humanity that is proactive, collaborative, and intellectually sophisticated. Humans were not simply reacting to environmental constraints, they were shaping their world, experimenting with ecological manipulation, and constructing systems of social, cognitive, and cultural knowledge. Proto-agriculture emerges as a lens through which we can understand the interplay of human cognition, emotion, and society. It represents a profound leap in foresight, cooperation, and abstraction, laying the foundation for the eventual rise of villages, towns, and cities. These early acts of cultivation were not just technical experiments, they were philosophical and social experiments, marking a crucial stage in the evolution of civilization. In the shadow of monumental ritual centers and amidst the warming landscapes of the post-glacial world, humans were quietly transforming their relationship with nature and with one another. They were learning that effort invested today could yield benefit tomorrow, that knowledge could be transmitted across generations, and that cooperation could achieve outcomes far beyond individual capacity. In these tentative interactions with plants, humans were testing the very limits of foresight, patience, and collective action. These early experiments were fragile, contingent, and easily disrupted, yet they carried the promise of a new kind of human existence, one in which the environment, social bonds, and cognitive ingenuity converged to create conditions for permanence, innovation, and the eventual flowering of civilization. Long before the domesticated sheep grazed in fenced pastures or cows provided milk in settled villages, humans were experimenting with the taming and management of animals in ways that were subtle, tentative, and transformative. These early encounters were not the product of formal agriculture or structured herding, but of observation, curiosity, and necessity. Hunter-gatherer groups had long interacted with wild herds, tracking their movements, understanding their behaviors, and relying on them for food, clothing, and tools. Over time, humans began to notice patterns in the movement of certain animals and the ways in which they could be influenced. Perhaps a herd would linger near a favored water source, or offspring raised in proximity to humans exhibited less fear. These observations laid the foundation for a radical shift in the human-animal relationship, one that would have profound ecological, social, and cognitive implications. The earliest forms of animal management were likely opportunistic and experimental. Humans may have selectively nurtured young animals, protected them from predators, or guided their movement to ensure access to meat, milk, or hides. This required careful attention, patience, and consistent effort. Success in these endeavors produced tangible rewards, reliable sources of nutrition and materials that reduced the risks inherent in hunting alone. Failure, however, carried consequences as well. Animals could escape, succumb to disease, or fail to reproduce, and labor invested in their management might be wasted. These trials demanded foresight, planning, and adaptability. Humans were learning that survival was not just about immediate consumption but about stewardship, anticipation, and cumulative knowledge. The cognitive demands of early animal domestication were considerable. Humans needed to recognize individual behaviors, track lineage, anticipate growth and reproduction, and understand seasonal patterns. They had to predict the needs of animals and assess the consequences of human intervention. This required abstract reasoning and complex planning. These mental exercises were intertwined with social cooperation, as managing even small herds necessitated coordination among group members. Roles may have been divided. Some individuals tended to feeding and protection, others to observation and tracking, and others still to ritual or symbolic engagement with the animals. Knowledge became distributed, cumulative, and intergenerational, forming a shared body of expertise essential for both survival and social cohesion. The social implications of animal management were profound. Control over animals and resources created new forms of interdependence and hierarchy. Individuals with skill in tracking, taming, or caring for animals gained influence, status, and responsibility within their communities. Rules regarding ownership, access, and distribution likely emerged organically, fostering negotiation, trust, and accountability. These dynamics reinforced cooperation while also introducing the first forms of social stratification based on expertise and contribution. Humans were learning to navigate the delicate balance between individual benefit and collective responsibility, a balance that would become central to the organization of later agricultural societies. Ecologically, early animal management reshaped landscapes and species interactions. Humans influenced grazing patterns, plant regeneration, and predator-prey dynamics. The presence of humans could alter animal behavior over time, creating a feedback loop in which animals adapted to human presence while humans adapted their practices in response. This delicate negotiation between species reflects a sophisticated ecological intelligence. Humans were learning that ecosystems were dynamic, interconnected, and responsive to intervention. These early experiments foreshadowed the more intensive manipulation of animal populations that would emerge with pastoralism, but they were grounded in observation, respect, and the iterative accumulation of experience. Emotion and psychology were deeply embedded in these interactions. Caring for animals required empathy, attentiveness, and an understanding of another species' needs. Humans experienced joy, frustration, hope, and anxiety as they engaged with creatures that were both dependent on and partially independent of them. The bonds formed through these interactions may have reinforced social cohesion and identity, as communities shared responsibility for animals that represented both sustenance and symbolic significance. In this way, the management of animals was not merely practical, it was a medium for the cultivation of trust, patience, and communal investment. Ritual and symbolism were likely intertwined with early animal domestication. Animals may have been incorporated into ceremonies, offerings, or myths, linking sustenance with cosmology and social meaning. Certain species may have been revered, protected, or associated with spiritual or cultural narratives. The act of managing animals thus became an arena for negotiating ethics, morality, and belief, embedding human-animal relationships within broader frameworks of social and cognitive life. Humans were learning that the management of other species could reinforce identity, transmit knowledge, and structure communal experience. The transition from hunting to tentative herding required significant flexibility and innovation. Humans had to adapt traditional knowledge of tracking, predation, and seasonal movement to the requirements of care and cultivation. They had to anticipate reproductive cycles, manage feeding, and protect animals from environmental hazards and predators. These adaptations demanded creativity, foresight, and collective problem-solving. Humans were not simply passive observers of nature, they were actively intervening, experimenting, and learning, setting the stage for more complex agricultural and pastoral systems. This iterative experimentation reflects a form of proto-science, systematic observation, trial and error, and cumulative understanding. The emergence of early animal management also had profound consequences for mobility and settlement. While humans still relied on hunting and foraging, the presence of managed animals provided a measure of predictability and stability. Groups could plan their movements around grazing patterns or the care of young animals, creating semi-permanent sites that balanced mobility with the benefits of resource control. This duality, remaining flexible while investing in longer-term assets, was a critical precursor to sedentary life. Humans were learning to negotiate temporal scales, balancing immediate needs with future security, and managing relationships with both their environment and each other over extended periods. Over time, these practices began to influence social structures in more complex ways. As animal management became more sophisticated, knowledge and skills became specialized, and the distribution of labor expanded. Certain individuals or lineages may have taken responsibility for specific animals or herds, creating proto-ownership systems and reinforcing social hierarchies. Decision-making around breeding, movement, and protection required negotiation and consensus, fostering the development of leadership roles and collaborative governance. Social cohesion was maintained through shared responsibility, collective labor, and cultural norms surrounding resource management. These early forms of organization laid the groundwork for the administrative, economic, and political systems that would emerge with fully developed pastoralism and agriculture. Cognitive evolution was equally significant. Humans were developing long-term planning abilities, systems thinking, and probabilistic reasoning as they anticipated animal behavior, environmental change, and the outcomes of intervention. They were learning to coordinate action across groups, integrate ecological knowledge, and transmit information intergenerationally. Early animal management nurtured a capacity for abstraction and foresight that would underpin later technological, agricultural, and social innovations. Humans were effectively training their minds to navigate complexity, uncertainty, and interdependence, a cognitive leap with consequences for every subsequent stage of civilization. Emotion, ritual, social organization, and ecological intelligence were intertwined in these practices. Humans were negotiating relationships with other species, each other, and the environment in ways that cultivated resilience, cooperation, and foresight. Animals were both material resources and symbolic partners, shaping culture, cognition, and social cohesion. The lessons learned through these early interactions, about patience, responsibility, collaboration, and prediction, were foundational to the emergence of permanent settlements, agriculture, and structured societies. They demonstrate that human ingenuity, curiosity, and adaptability were already operating at profound levels tens of thousands of years before Sumer, shaping trajectories that would define the trajectory of civilization. By carefully observing, managing, and sometimes guiding animals, humans were transforming themselves as much as they were transforming the natural world. They were learning to invest in the future, balance risk and reward, and cooperate on scales that extended beyond immediate necessity. Early domestication was not simply a practical innovation, it was a cognitive, social, and ethical revolution. These tentative steps toward herding created networks of knowledge, social responsibility, and ecological interaction that would ripple across generations. In the interplay between humans and animals, we witness the emergence of foresight, abstraction, and social complexity, the essential building blocks of the civilization that would one day rise in the Fertile Crescent and across the world. Even in the earliest semi-permanent settlements, long before the rise of cities and formal markets, humans were beginning to weave the threads of connection that would become trade and communication networks. These interactions emerged naturally from necessity, curiosity, and the growing complexity of human society. Seasonal camps, ritual centers, and areas of early cultivation created focal points where groups gathered, exchanged knowledge, shared resources, and observed one another's techniques. Humans were mobile, yet their movement was increasingly patterned, creating predictable points of contact across landscapes. Within these intersections, exchange was both material and cultural. Tools, animal products, seeds, and crafted goods were shared, while knowledge, stories, rituals, and symbolic practices traveled alongside tangible items. These interactions fostered trust, cooperation, and an emergent sense of regional identity, even among groups that were still primarily hunter-gatherers. The scale of these interactions was remarkable for the time. Humans traversed mountains, rivers, and deserts to reach familiar camps or resource-rich regions, and they carried with them not only physical goods but also ideas and techniques. Knowledge of tool-making, animal management, and plant cultivation could spread from one group to another, accelerating the collective learning process. A blade designed for efficient butchering might inspire variations in neighboring communities, just as techniques for storing seeds or caring for young animals might diffuse across regions. Humans were effectively creating distributed knowledge networks, with repeated interactions forming the backbone of what would eventually become trade systems. These networks were informal, dynamic, and adaptive, but they were also highly effective at spreading innovation and facilitating cooperation across vast landscapes. The motivations behind early exchange were as varied as the goods themselves. Practical needs, access to rare stones for tools, pigments for symbolic purposes, or plant and animal species unavailable locally, drove humans to seek out distant groups. But beyond utility, there were social, symbolic, and ritual incentives. Exchange could reinforce alliances, demonstrate status, and facilitate marriage and kinship ties. Participation in these networks became a way to navigate social landscapes, establish reputation, and signal trustworthiness. Humans were negotiating relationships through objects and knowledge, creating a form of social capital that operated alongside subsistence strategies and survival imperatives. The material and social dimensions of early trade were deeply intertwined, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of reciprocity, obligation, and influence. Communication in these networks extended beyond the exchange of objects. Humans carried stories, rituals, and symbolic systems with them, transmitting knowledge that was often encoded in performance, gesture, or oral narrative. Myths, seasonal markers, and ritual practices traveled alongside seeds, tools, and hides, allowing communities to align calendars, coordinate labor, and synchronize ceremonial events. Humans were creating shared cognitive and cultural frameworks that extended across space and time, linking otherwise autonomous groups into broader social systems. These early networks facilitated both survival and the construction of meaning, fostering a sense of belonging and interconnection that transcended individual settlements. The environmental dimension of early trade was significant. Humans had to navigate challenging landscapes, understanding seasonal patterns, water availability, and the movement of animals to reach other communities safely. The predictability of these routes was crucial, as travel carried both opportunity and risk. Humans developed mental maps of regions, noting resource locations, hazards, and points of contact. This geographic intelligence was not only practical but also cognitive. Humans were integrating spatial awareness, memory, and social knowledge to maintain networks over time. The landscape itself became a medium of connection, with paths, rivers, and valleys functioning as conduits for goods, ideas, and culture. Labor and social organization were essential to maintaining these networks. Long-distance exchange required cooperation, planning, and coordination. Groups had to allocate time and resources to travel, protect goods, and negotiate interactions with other communities. Leadership may have emerged situationally, based on knowledge of routes, negotiation skill, or social authority. Social norms governing reciprocity, fairness, and conflict resolution would have been critical for sustaining trust across distances. In these networks, humans were developing the foundations of economic and diplomatic practice, long before writing, currency, or formal states emerged. Trust and reputation were the currency, and relationships were maintained through repeated interaction and mutual understanding. The cognitive implications of early trade networks were profound. Humans were learning to anticipate the behavior of others, assess risk and opportunity, and strategize over temporal and spatial scales. They were cultivating memory, abstraction, and foresight, integrating ecological, social, and material knowledge to navigate complex systems of interaction. This capacity for distributed cognition allowed groups to innovate, adapt, and expand the reach of their social and material influence. Knowledge was no longer localized, it flowed across networks, accelerating learning and creating cumulative cultural evolution. These dynamics laid the groundwork for more formalized economies, governance structures, and interregional connectivity that would characterize later civilizations. Symbolism and ritual continued to intersect with exchange. Objects were not purely functional, they carried meaning, identity, and social significance. A finely crafted tool, a decorated vessel, or a rare pigment could serve as a token of alliance, a gift in ritual exchange, or a marker of status and achievement. Humans were embedding social, moral, and symbolic codes within material culture, using objects as vehicles for communication, negotiation, and cohesion. Trade and ritual were mutually reinforcing, creating layered systems of interaction that integrated practical, social, and cognitive dimensions. In this sense, early exchange was as much about shaping human relationships and cultural identity as it was about procuring resources. Early networks of interaction also facilitated resilience. By connecting multiple groups, humans created systems that could buffer environmental variability, resource scarcity, or social disruption. Knowledge of alternative hunting grounds, plant and animal resources, or seasonal patterns could be shared to mitigate risk. Social alliances could provide support in times of crisis, and mobility could be coordinated to maximize safety and efficiency. Humans were constructing systems of redundancy, cooperation, and mutual support that increased the capacity of communities to survive and thrive in unpredictable environments. These practices reflect a deep understanding of interdependence and the value of long-term planning, both of which are essential to the emergence of complex societies. The development of these proto-trade and communication networks also catalyzed innovation. Exposure to new materials, techniques, and ideas inspired experimentation and adaptation. Humans observed and incorporated practices from other groups, integrating them into local knowledge systems. These exchanges accelerated technological and cultural evolution, enabling humans to refine tools, diversify subsistence strategies, and enhance symbolic and ritual practices. Networks were not merely conduits of goods, they were conduits of imagination, creativity, and shared intelligence. Humans were learning to leverage collective knowledge across distances, enhancing both survival and cultural complexity. Emotion and identity were inseparable from these networks. Participation fostered a sense of belonging, trust, and recognition. Reciprocal exchange reinforced social bonds, signaled reliability, and established reputations that could endure across generations. Humans were negotiating relationships not only with objects and resources but with other people, cultivating empathy, diplomacy, and cooperation. These networks shaped social landscapes as much as physical ones, creating overlapping systems of obligation, alliance, and influence that extended far beyond the immediate community. By linking settlements, ritual centers, and resource-rich regions, early humans were creating the scaffolding for civilization. These interactions demonstrated that mobility and cooperation could coexist with innovation and specialization. Trade and communication networks allowed humans to extend the reach of knowledge, coordinate over distances, and experiment with social and economic strategies that would later define villages, towns, and cities. Through these connections, humans were building a shared cognitive, cultural, and material infrastructure that enabled cumulative learning, social cohesion, and the eventual rise of organized societies. These early networks were the arteries of civilization, carrying knowledge, resources, and culture across the landscapes of the post-glacial world, shaping the trajectory of humanity long before the written record began. Long before the clay tablets of Mesopotamia recorded transactions and laws, humans were already embarking on technological journeys that would transform their interaction with the world. Stone, bone, wood, and fiber were being manipulated with extraordinary skill, as humans experimented with forms, materials, and techniques in ways that reveal not only practicality but imagination and foresight. Tools were no longer mere implements for survival, they became extensions of human cognition, enabling complex tasks, shaping social interaction, and catalyzing innovation. Each refinement in blade, spear, or grinding implement represented an iterative experiment, a careful negotiation between material properties, environmental conditions, and human intent. In these early technological laboratories, humans were discovering principles of mechanics, ergonomics, and efficiency, long before formal science would articulate them. The emergence of specialized tools signaled a profound cognitive leap. Humans were learning to abstract function from form, understanding that certain shapes, weights, and edges could achieve predictable results. They were also beginning to recognize the importance of standardization. A consistent blade or grinding stone could be reproduced and shared, allowing knowledge to persist across generations. This level of abstraction required memory, foresight, and planning, as well as the ability to imagine a result that did not yet exist. Humans were thinking in sequences, selecting raw material, shaping it, and anticipating its performance in a specific task. Each act of toolmaking was both a practical intervention and a cognitive exercise, training humans in problem-solving, cause and effect, and iterative refinement. Materials themselves were subjects of experimentation. Flint, obsidian, bone, and antler were tested for hardness, durability, and sharpness. Wood was selected for its flexibility and resilience, fibers for strength and pliability. Humans observed, compared, and refined their choices, accumulating practical knowledge that would become the foundation of complex craft systems. This careful attention to material properties reflects not only intelligence but patience, curiosity, and a willingness to learn through trial, error, and observation. Humans were engaged in what we might call early engineering, manipulating the physical world with awareness of constraints, possibilities, and desired outcomes. The social dimension of technological innovation was equally significant. Knowledge of toolmaking, repair, and refinement became specialized, creating roles and responsibilities within groups. Individuals with expertise in flint knapping, bone carving, or weaving could exert influence, transmit skills, and contribute to group survival and efficiency. Tools became vehicles of social transmission, as skills were taught, demonstrated, and practiced collectively. Apprenticeship and observation allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations, producing continuity and fostering cumulative innovation. Technology and society were deeply intertwined. Tools shaped behavior, cooperation, and hierarchy just as much as they enhanced survival. Innovation extended beyond individual tools to systems of production and organization. Humans were learning to combine multiple implements into coordinated processes, grinding grain, processing hides, preparing food, or constructing shelters. These sequences required foresight, planning, and coordination, reinforcing both cognitive and social complexity. Individuals had to understand not only the function of each tool but also how tools interacted within larger workflows. This systems thinking represents a fundamental step toward complex craft production, division of labor, and eventual industrial specialization. Humans were beginning to see tasks as networks of interdependent actions, requiring coordination, timing, and cumulative knowledge. The interplay between technology and environment was crucial. Humans were adapting tools to different ecological contexts, sharper blades for dense forests, lighter points for open plains, specialized cutting implements for particular species. This adaptive approach demonstrates ecological intelligence, integrating observation of environmental conditions with the material manipulation of resources. Humans were learning to optimize efficiency while responding flexibly to variability, creating a dynamic relationship with the world that combined practicality, creativity, and foresight. The environment was both a challenge and a collaborator, shaping technological experimentation and reward. Cultural and symbolic dimensions were embedded in technological practice. Tools were often not purely functional, they carried social, ritual, or aesthetic significance. Elaborate handles, decorative carvings, or specific forms could indicate status, identity, or group affiliation. Humans were encoding meaning in material culture, transforming tools into vessels of social expression. This integration of function and symbolism reflects a sophisticated cognitive capacity. Humans were capable of abstract thought, imagining significance beyond immediate utility, and embedding narrative, identity, and ideology into crafted objects. Craft became a medium of communication, memory, and cultural transmission. The development of specialized tools also enhanced human capability in subsistence, construction, and social interaction. Sharper blades and points increased hunting efficiency, enabling humans to access a wider range of resources. Grinding stones and processing tools allowed for the preparation and storage of plant foods, supporting sedentism and population growth. Construction implements facilitated the creation of shelters, enclosures, and monumental structures, linking technological innovation with social complexity. Tools amplified human agency, extending the reach of cognition, labor, and imagination into material reality. Each technological advance was a multiplier, reshaping both survival strategies and social potential. Labor investment in tool production and maintenance required cooperation and organization. Quarrying raw material, shaping implements, and distributing tools demanded coordinated effort. Humans had to allocate time, manage resources, and transmit expertise efficiently. In this process, social structures were reinforced, and collective problem-solving became a necessary skill. Leadership, division of labor, and apprenticeship emerged organically within these technological frameworks, demonstrating that cognition, society, and craft were mutually constitutive. Humans were practicing coordination, foresight, and knowledge management on scales that would later underpin complex societies and urban life. Cognitive development was further reinforced through iterative experimentation. Each tool represented a hypothesis, a design intended to achieve a particular result. Failure prompted observation, refinement, and adaptation. Success allowed replication, teaching, and dissemination. This trial-and-error approach nurtured abstract thinking, causal reasoning, and predictive modeling. Humans were engaging in cumulative technological evolution, in which knowledge was not only preserved but enhanced with each generation. Skills were codified in practice, memory, and ritual, creating a foundation for increasingly sophisticated craft, engineering, and eventually written codification of knowledge. Technological innovation was also deeply connected to mobility and landscape. Humans adapted tools to exploit diverse ecological zones, tracking resources, seasonality, and animal migration. Portable implements enabled flexibility, while specialized craft objects facilitated resource processing and storage. Knowledge of tool function, material properties, and environmental application became embedded in both individual skill and collective practice. Humans were learning to integrate cognition, ecology, and material culture in ways that maximized efficiency, resilience, and adaptability. Tools became extensions of perception, labor, and imagination, amplifying human capacity to shape both social and natural environments. Through these innovations, humans were not merely surviving, they were experimenting, imagining, and extending the boundaries of possibility. Technology became a medium for thought, problem-solving, and cultural expression. Each crafted object carried layers of information, functional, symbolic, and social. Humans were practicing foresight, coordination, and abstraction, integrating labor, cognition, and community in ways that laid the groundwork for civilization. The emergence of specialized tools and complex craft systems demonstrates that human ingenuity, observation, and creativity were already operating at sophisticated levels tens of thousands of years before the urban civilizations of Sumer and beyond. In the hands of early humans, tools were more than instruments, they were catalysts for social, cognitive, and cultural transformation, shaping the trajectory of humanity in profound and enduring ways. Long before the first city walls of Mesopotamia rose from the soil, humans were already exploring the world of symbols, images, and abstract expression. Deep within caves, carved into stone, or etched onto bones and antlers, humans were leaving traces of imagination that transcended immediate survival. These early forms of art were not mere decoration, they were deliberate acts of meaning-making, communicating ideas, beliefs, and emotions across space and time. The earliest symbolic expressions, hand stencils, geometric patterns, and depictions of animals, reflect cognitive sophistication, a capacity for abstraction, and a desire to externalize thought into tangible forms. In these acts, humans were practicing the foundations of culture, encoding knowledge, identity, and cosmology into objects that could outlast a single lifetime. The creation of symbolic artifacts required foresight, skill, and planning. Humans had to select appropriate materials, charcoal, ochre, bone, or stone, prepare surfaces, and envision the intended outcome. Each mark, line, or carving was a choice, a negotiation between physical constraints and creative intention. The process demanded attention, patience, and a degree of mastery over materials and techniques, suggesting not only technical proficiency but cognitive depth. Humans were thinking across time, imagining the effect their work would have on others, and engaging in communication that extended beyond the immediate sensory experience. These expressions were early experiments in abstraction, teaching humans to represent ideas, relationships, and concepts symbolically rather than purely functionally. Symbolism in early human expression was deeply intertwined with ritual and social cohesion. Cave paintings, carved figurines, and engraved objects were often situated in spaces that held communal significance, whether natural caves, ceremonial grounds, or domestic areas. Engaging with these symbols was a shared experience, reinforcing social bonds, transmitting knowledge, and guiding collective behavior. Art became a medium through which communities negotiated identity, cosmology, and morality, linking the visible and invisible worlds. Humans were exploring the relationship between perception, memory, and meaning, using symbols to structure experience and cultivate shared understanding. Animals feature prominently in early symbolic expression, often rendered with remarkable fidelity and dynamism. Horses, bison, lions, and birds were depicted in motion, suggesting careful observation, familiarity, and an intimate relationship with the natural world. Beyond mere documentation, these representations may have carried spiritual or mythological significance, reflecting humans' attempts to comprehend forces beyond their control. The act of depicting animals was simultaneously practical, cognitive, and imaginative. Humans encoded knowledge of behavior, anatomy, and ecology while exploring abstract concepts such as power, danger, and transformation. Through these images, humans were negotiating their relationship with other species, the environment, and the forces that govern survival. Geometric and abstract symbols, often overlooked, are equally revealing. Repeated patterns, spirals, grids, and dots suggest the emergence of proto-writing or symbolic codification. These marks may have served mnemonic purposes, encoded seasonal cycles, or represented social or ritual concepts. Humans were learning that symbols could carry layered meaning, that abstract forms could communicate information and emotion across individuals and generations. This capacity for abstraction laid the foundation for later systems of writing, numeracy, and record-keeping, demonstrating that symbolic cognition was already highly developed long before urban civilization. The social dimension of symbolic expression cannot be overstated. The creation, interpretation, and transmission of symbols required shared conventions and understanding. Art was a social practice as much as a cognitive or aesthetic one. Communities collectively reinforced meaning, transmitted knowledge, and mediated behavior through symbolic engagement. Participation in symbolic activities created cohesion, structured ritual, and established social norms. Humans were using imagination as a tool for social organization, exploring how shared symbols could shape relationships, hierarchies, and collective identity. Art was not simply individual expression, it was a mechanism for coordinating thought, action, and belief at the group level. Ritualized interaction with symbols amplified their cognitive and social impact. The placement of carvings in caves or enclosures suggests deliberate sequencing, spatial awareness, and attention to audience. Humans were orchestrating experience, guiding perception, and creating environments imbued with meaning. The act of creating and engaging with symbolic spaces likely elicited emotion, contemplation, and reflection, deepening cognitive engagement. Humans were exploring not just what symbols meant but how they could be experienced, internalized, and transmitted, experimenting with the interplay between material form, perception, and thought. The production of symbolic artifacts also stimulated technological innovation. Crafting precise engravings, applying pigments, or carving small figurines demanded tools, skill, and coordination. Humans developed specialized implements, refined techniques, and experimented with materials, pushing both cognitive and practical boundaries. Symbolic expression and technology evolved hand in hand, each enabling and amplifying the other. Humans were engaged in iterative problem-solving, refining tools to express ideas more effectively, and refining ideas to explore new possibilities of expression. This dynamic interplay between cognition, material, and creativity characterizes the trajectory of human cultural evolution. Emotion and identity were inseparable from symbolic activity. Humans invested time, energy, and imagination in creating objects that reflected individual skill, group identity, and communal values. Symbols conveyed messages of power, fertility, survival, and cosmology, shaping perception and guiding behavior. They mediated relationships between the individual, the group, and the natural or spiritual world. Engagement with symbols cultivated empathy, memory, and abstract thought, embedding cognitive and social practices in the very act of creation. Humans were shaping both themselves and their communities through symbolic articulation, rehearsing capacities for reflection, projection, and shared understanding. Symbolic expression also fostered cumulative learning. Techniques, motifs, and meanings could be transmitted across generations, refined, and innovated upon. This continuity enabled cultural memory, creating a sense of history, ancestry, and identity that extended beyond immediate experience. Humans were building networks of knowledge and meaning, linking craft, cognition, ritual, and social cohesion into durable systems. Symbolic practices became laboratories for experimentation, testing ideas about cause and effect, narrative, representation, and abstraction in ways that structured both thought and society. Imagination played a critical role in these developments. Humans were able to envision entities, relationships, and concepts that did not exist in immediate reality, and to externalize them into visual, tactile, and performative forms. This capacity for creative projection is a hallmark of advanced cognition, underpinning problem-solving, planning, and innovation. By representing unseen forces, future possibilities, or abstract concepts, humans extended the limits of their perception and thought. Symbolic expression was simultaneously pragmatic, cognitive, and visionary, cultivating capacities that would become central to the emergence of writing, urban planning, and complex ritual systems. Early symbolic practice demonstrates that humans were constructing reality as much as recording it. By externalizing thought, emotion, and experience, humans created artifacts and spaces that shaped perception, memory, and behavior. These practices mediated relationships with the environment, other species, and each other, embedding knowledge, meaning, and social norms in material and experiential forms. Humans were exploring the boundaries of imagination, abstraction, and communication, discovering that symbols could structure cognition, social interaction, and cultural continuity. In this sense, symbolic expression was not merely artistic, it was foundational to the evolution of human consciousness, society, and civilization. By tracing the arc of early symbolic activity, we can see the emergence of capacities that would define human culture: abstraction, narrative, foresight, and the projection of meaning across time and space. These early acts of art and symbolism were experiments in thought, memory, and social cohesion, preparing humans for the complex cognitive, social, and technological landscapes of the Neolithic and beyond. They reveal a species already capable of shaping both material and immaterial worlds, crafting objects, spaces, and practices that would resonate across generations. Symbolic expression was the first step in a long continuum of imagination, creativity, and collective cognition that would culminate in cities, writing, and civilizations. Long before the first cities of Sumer rose along the Tigris and Euphrates, humans were experimenting with permanence, gradually transitioning from seasonal mobility to enduring settlements that reflected a new understanding of space, labor, and community. These early settlements were not cities in the modern sense, but they were remarkable laboratories of social, economic, and cultural innovation. People were beginning to invest labor and resources into specific locations, cultivating plants, tending animals, and constructing semi-permanent shelters that required planning, coordination, and long-term commitment. The decision to remain in one place for extended periods represented a profound cognitive and social shift, one that intertwined environmental awareness, technological skill, and social cooperation. Settlements emerged at the intersection of resource availability and human ingenuity. Proximity to water sources, fertile soils, and abundant game created opportunities for repeated occupation, while humans modified the landscape to enhance productivity. Early agricultural experiments allowed for predictable food supplies, supporting denser populations and enabling more specialized labor. Tending to domesticated animals supplemented hunting and foraging, providing reliable sources of protein, hides, and secondary products such as milk and wool. Humans were learning to balance immediate survival with long-term investment, recognizing that stability in location could yield benefits beyond what mobility alone could provide. These settlements were not static, they were dynamic, evolving in response to environmental conditions, social organization, and technological innovation. Social structures within these early settlements grew increasingly complex. The concentration of people necessitated coordination in labor, resource allocation, and conflict resolution. Roles likely emerged based on skill, knowledge, and social influence. Some individuals specialized in agriculture, animal husbandry, or craft production, while others assumed responsibilities in ritual leadership, trade, or conflict mediation. These divisions of labor were not rigid but fluid, adapting to the needs of the community. The management of communal resources, such as water channels, food stores, and ritual spaces, required negotiation, cooperation, and trust. Humans were experimenting with social governance on scales larger than the small hunter-gatherer groups of earlier eras. Ritual continued to play a central role in these emerging settlements, linking the material and spiritual dimensions of daily life. Sacred spaces, ceremonial structures, and symbolic artifacts mediated relationships between humans, animals, and the environment. Rituals provided occasions for reinforcing social cohesion, transmitting knowledge, and coordinating labor for communal projects. By integrating belief systems with subsistence activities, humans were embedding meaning into everyday practices. Planting and harvesting were not purely pragmatic, they were accompanied by ritualized observances that reinforced ethical norms, temporal cycles, and communal identity. Settlement life was thus a fusion of the practical and the symbolic, where the material, cognitive, and spiritual dimensions of human experience were inseparable. The technological landscape of early settlements was equally sophisticated. Humans refined tools for agriculture, construction, and craft, enabling more efficient labor and experimentation. Grinding stones, digging implements, and cutting tools facilitated food production and preparation, while specialized implements supported craft and artistic expression. Architectural innovations, such as mud brick construction, stone foundations, and circular or rectangular dwellings, reflected both practical considerations and social organization. The design and maintenance of communal structures required coordination, planning, and the transmission of knowledge, reinforcing cognitive, social, and cultural complexity. Settlements became arenas in which technology, labor, and community co-evolved. The integration of agriculture, animal management, and ritual in settlements had profound ecological implications. Humans were actively shaping landscapes through cultivation, grazing, and water management. The cumulative effects of human activity altered plant and animal populations, soil fertility, and local ecosystems. These interventions required careful observation, experimentation, and adaptation, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of ecological interdependence. Humans were learning to anticipate consequences, manage risk, and optimize resource use in ways that went beyond immediate survival, laying the groundwork for more intensive agriculture and eventually urban life. Settlements were sites of experimentation not only in social organization but also in ecological management. Population dynamics within settlements created both opportunities and challenges. Higher densities allowed for collaborative labor, the specialization of skills, and the accumulation of knowledge, but they also increased competition for resources, susceptibility to disease, and the complexity of social negotiation. Humans developed strategies for managing these pressures, including cooperative labor systems, social norms, ritual regulation, and technological innovation. The interplay of population density, resource management, and social cohesion required humans to think strategically, communicate effectively, and anticipate the needs and behaviors of others. Settlements were laboratories of social intelligence, fostering capacities that would become essential for cities and states. Trade and communication networks extended the reach of settlements beyond their immediate environment. Exchange of raw materials, food products, and crafted goods connected communities, allowing knowledge, technology, and cultural practices to diffuse across regions. Interaction with neighboring groups facilitated alliances, mitigated resource scarcity, and enhanced resilience in the face of environmental challenges. Early settlements were not isolated, they were nodes in broader networks of mobility, exchange, and communication. Humans were learning to navigate intergroup relations, negotiate access to resources, and maintain trust across distance, skills that would be fundamental to the emergence of complex urban societies. Cognitive and emotional dimensions were inseparable from settlement life. Humans had to plan labor, monitor ecological systems, and maintain social cohesion while balancing immediate needs with long-term objectives. Emotional engagement, patience, foresight, empathy, and trust, was critical for sustaining cooperation, particularly in communal projects such as construction, agriculture, or ritual observance. Settlement life demanded the integration of practical knowledge, social intelligence, and moral reasoning, reinforcing capacities for abstract thought, problem-solving, and collective action. Humans were shaping not only their environment but their cognitive and emotional landscapes, preparing the groundwork for sustained social and cultural complexity. The spatial organization of settlements reflected both practicality and social structure. Dwellings, storage areas, communal spaces, and ritual enclosures were arranged to facilitate daily life, coordinate labor, and reinforce social norms. Access to resources, visibility, and proximity to ritual sites shaped the layout of early settlements. Humans were experimenting with concepts of territory, privacy, and communal space, integrating functional, social, and symbolic considerations. The very design of settlements encoded cultural priorities, reflecting an understanding of human behavior, social interaction, and environmental adaptation. These spatial innovations were precursors to urban planning, zoning, and infrastructural organization in later civilizations. Symbolic and artistic expression remained central within settlement contexts. Engraved stones, figurines, and decorated tools were not merely aesthetic, they encoded identity, cosmology, and social memory. Ritual and symbolic objects mediated relationships among community members, between humans and animals, and with the surrounding environment. The integration of art, ritual, and daily labor fostered cohesion, continuity, and shared understanding. Humans were practicing cultural transmission in tangible forms, embedding knowledge, values, and identity within the material and social fabric of settlement life. Settlements also fostered innovation in subsistence strategies. Humans refined crop cultivation techniques, experimented with irrigation, and developed early storage methods to buffer against scarcity. Animal management evolved in tandem, supporting a more reliable and diversified food base. These practices required observation, experimentation, and cumulative knowledge, demonstrating the integration of cognitive, technological, and social skills. Humans were building systems of resilience, foresight, and adaptation that would support increasingly complex societies and larger population centers. The emergence of semi-permanent settlements marked a critical step toward civilization. Humans were learning to combine labor, ritual, technology, and ecological management in ways that extended across time and space. Social structures became more layered, cognitive capacities more advanced, and cultural knowledge more durable. Settlements were not merely places of habitation, they were crucibles for experimentation, innovation, and collective intelligence. The lessons learned, about cooperation, resource management, ritual, and symbolic expression, would resonate through subsequent millennia, shaping the trajectory of human civilization. In these early communities, humans were discovering the principles that would allow cities to flourish, writing to emerge, and complex societies to endure. Long before monumental canals carved through the plains of Mesopotamia, humans were experimenting with the subtle manipulation of water to sustain life, crops, and settlements. Access to reliable water sources had always been a primary determinant of human survival, but as groups began to settle for extended periods, dependence on seasonal rivers, rainfall, and groundwater demanded foresight, innovation, and careful observation. Humans began to notice the rhythms of rivers and streams, the rise and fall of seasonal floods, and the ways in which water nourished or hindered plant growth. These insights formed the foundation of early water management strategies, proto-irrigation systems that reflected both practical necessity and the cognitive leap required to plan for a future not immediately present. The earliest water management experiments were likely modest, involving simple channels or the diversion of small streams to encourage the growth of wild grains and edible plants near settlements. Humans dug shallow furrows, redirected runoff, and created rudimentary reservoirs to store water for drier periods. These interventions required not only physical labor but careful observation of environmental patterns, soil permeability, rainfall timing, flood behavior, and the water needs of particular plants. Humans were learning to manipulate the environment with subtlety, balancing intervention with the understanding that excessive tampering could lead to erosion, plant failure, or unintended ecological consequences. These early systems were fragile, experimental, and deeply intertwined with local ecological knowledge. Labor and social coordination were essential components of water management. Constructing even simple channels demanded collective effort, as well as planning and maintenance. Communities had to agree on who would dig, maintain, and monitor water distribution, creating early forms of cooperative labor management and social governance. Disputes over access and allocation likely emerged, necessitating norms, negotiation, and rules to ensure fairness and sustainability. In this way, early water management was as much a social and political exercise as a technological one, reinforcing cooperation, leadership, and interdependence among settlement members. The cognitive demands of early water management were considerable. Humans needed to anticipate seasonal variation, calculate labor requirements, and predict the outcomes of intervention. They had to integrate multiple streams of knowledge: hydrology, soil science, plant biology, and weather patterns. This form of systems thinking required abstraction, observation over extended periods, and the capacity to adjust strategies based on feedback. Humans were engaging in proto-engineering, modeling environmental processes, and designing interventions that would amplify the productivity and stability of their settlements. Water management thus became a crucible for cognitive development, linking practical action with planning, foresight, and iterative learning. Early water systems also fostered technological innovation. Humans experimented with tools to dig, channel, and regulate water flow. Stones, wood, and clay may have been used to line channels or create reservoirs, while simple gates or embankments helped control distribution. Techniques evolved through observation, trial and error, and shared knowledge, leading to increasingly sophisticated methods for capturing, directing, and conserving water. These technological practices were closely linked to cognitive and social processes. Coordination, measurement, and communal labor reinforced skills and capacities that extended beyond hydrology into broader aspects of settlement life. The environmental implications of proto-irrigation were profound. Redirecting water altered plant growth, soil composition, and local ecosystems. Humans were learning that intervention could enhance productivity but also required balance and restraint. Floods could enrich soil yet destroy crops, and mismanaged channels could erode fertile land. Understanding these dynamics demanded careful monitoring, adaptation, and respect for the complexity of natural systems. In managing water, humans were cultivating ecological intelligence, learning to anticipate and respond to variability, and integrating observation, experimentation, and strategic planning into daily life. Settlement stability was intimately tied to successful water management. Communities with effective water systems could support higher population densities, extended periods of occupation, and more reliable agricultural output. Conversely, poor water control could lead to scarcity, social tension, and displacement. Proto-irrigation created the conditions for the growth of semi-permanent and eventually permanent settlements, facilitating the concentration of labor, the specialization of skills, and the accumulation of knowledge and resources. Humans were learning to invest in infrastructure as a form of social and economic security, linking environmental engineering with survival, cooperation, and long-term planning. Water management was also closely intertwined with ritual and cultural practice. Rivers, springs, and wells may have been considered sacred or imbued with spiritual significance, and human intervention in these systems could have been accompanied by ceremonial observances. Rituals likely served multiple purposes, reinforcing community cohesion, marking seasonal cycles, expressing gratitude or respect, and regulating labor. By integrating ritual with practical water control, humans were embedding ethical, social, and spiritual dimensions into environmental management. This integration reinforced both ecological awareness and social norms, ensuring that water systems were maintained responsibly and collaboratively. Trade and communication networks were enhanced by water management as well. Communities with reliable water access could support surpluses, allowing them to exchange goods, knowledge, and cultural practices with neighboring groups. Water systems facilitated the storage and transport of agricultural products, increasing resilience against seasonal variation and fostering regional interdependence. Proto-irrigation thus contributed not only to local productivity but to broader networks of exchange, social alliance, and cultural diffusion. Humans were learning to leverage environmental modification for both immediate survival and strategic regional influence. The emotional and cognitive dimensions of water management were deeply intertwined. Humans experienced hope, anxiety, satisfaction, and frustration as they observed the outcomes of intervention. Success in channeling water to crops reinforced trust, collaboration, and the capacity for long-term planning. Failure demanded adaptation, resilience, and problem-solving. Through these experiences, humans were cultivating foresight, patience, and the ability to navigate complex cause and effect relationships. Water management became a medium for training not only the body but also the mind, integrating environmental observation, labor coordination, and social negotiation into a coherent system of practice and cognition. Over time, water management practices became increasingly sophisticated, setting the stage for more intensive agriculture and permanent settlement. Humans began to understand the cumulative benefits of labor investment, infrastructure maintenance, and ecological observation. They experimented with multiple channels, reservoirs, and water distribution strategies, observing outcomes, refining techniques, and codifying knowledge. These cumulative processes laid the groundwork for the large-scale irrigation systems that would define civilizations such as Sumer, where human ingenuity would shape rivers, landscapes, and the trajectory of history itself. The integration of water management with agriculture, animal husbandry, and settlement life created a holistic system of environmental, social, and technological interaction. Humans were no longer simply responding to natural cycles, they were beginning to anticipate, guide, and amplify them. Water became both a resource and a medium of collective action, linking survival, labor, ritual, and knowledge transmission. The lessons learned in these early experiments, about cooperation, foresight, and ecological intelligence, would resonate across millennia, shaping the cognitive, social, and technological foundations of civilization. Proto-irrigation demonstrates that human ingenuity is inseparable from context, physical, social, and cognitive. Managing water required integration of observation, experimentation, communication, and labor, forging capacities that would underpin more complex infrastructure, urban planning, and political organization. Communities learned that success depended not only on effort but on coordination, knowledge sharing, and ethical management. These early experiments reveal a human species already capable of sophisticated environmental engineering, social negotiation, and strategic foresight, laying the foundation for the transformation of the Fertile Crescent into one of the cradles of civilization. Long before the temples of Ur and the ziggurats of later Mesopotamia dominated the landscape, humans were developing complex spiritual frameworks that sought to explain their place in the world, the cycles of nature, and the unseen forces that shaped existence. Proto-religion was not a formal institution but a tapestry of beliefs, rituals, symbols, and communal practices that emerged organically from the interactions between humans, animals, and the environment. People observed the sun rising and setting, the changing seasons, the fertility of the soil, and the behaviors of animals, and in doing so, they began to infer patterns, causes, and intentionality in the world around them. These observations, interpreted through imagination and social dialogue, gave rise to early cosmologies, narratives that framed life, death, abundance, and scarcity in ways that connected the tangible and the intangible. Rituals were central to this emergent spiritual consciousness. Ceremonies, dances, offerings, and symbolic gestures were employed to communicate with forces perceived as greater than the human community. These acts were deeply entwined with survival practices. Planting and harvesting cycles, hunting expeditions, and water management were often accompanied by ritualized observances. Humans were recognizing that actions in the material world were interwoven with symbolic meaning, and that intentional acts of reverence or supplication could influence outcomes. This perception fostered social cohesion, as shared belief systems and communal ceremonies reinforced group identity, ethical norms, and collective responsibility. Ritual was both a cognitive tool and a social mechanism, aligning practical needs with moral and cultural frameworks. The development of proto-religion also had profound cognitive implications. Humans were engaging in abstract thought, constructing narratives that linked cause and effect across time, space, and human action. They imagined beings, forces, or spirits that were invisible yet influential, demonstrating the capacity for theory of mind, moral reasoning, and predictive modeling. These beliefs allowed humans to conceptualize long-term consequences, social obligations, and ethical behavior in ways that transcended immediate experience. Cognitive sophistication was thus inseparable from spiritual practice. Humans were learning to structure thought, memory, and behavior through narrative, symbolism, and ritual, laying the groundwork for later theological, philosophical, and ethical systems. Symbolism played a pivotal role in early religious expression. Carvings, figurines, painted motifs, and ceremonial objects encoded meaning, conveying cosmological principles, social norms, or ethical guidelines. Fertility figures, depictions of animals, and abstract geometric patterns were not merely artistic, they carried layered significance. They represented ideas about reproduction, sustenance, predation, and human agency, functioning as mnemonic devices and moral guides. Humans were externalizing thought, transforming intangible beliefs into material form, and creating a shared language of symbols that could be interpreted across individuals, generations, and even groups. Symbolic expression thus served as both cognitive scaffolding and social glue. The social dimensions of proto-religion were profound. Ritual specialists, elders, or individuals with particular knowledge or charisma may have assumed leadership roles, guiding ceremonies, mediating disputes, and transmitting sacred knowledge. These roles were not purely authoritative, they were deeply relational, requiring trust, empathy, and a nuanced understanding of group dynamics. Humans were experimenting with hierarchical structures, moral authority, and social influence, all of which were mediated through spiritual practice. Shared belief systems enabled cooperation on unprecedented scales, allowing larger communities to organize labor, manage resources, and undertake communal projects such as construction, irrigation, or defense. Environmental observation continued to inform religious and cosmological thought. Humans recognized the interdependence between natural phenomena and human survival, interpreting patterns in rivers, rainfall, animal migration, and seasonal cycles as expressions of intentionality or cosmic order. Rituals often corresponded to these cycles, aligning human activity with perceived natural rhythms. This integration of ecological understanding with spiritual practice enhanced survival, reinforcing behaviors that promoted sustainable resource management, social cohesion, and collective foresight. Humans were constructing systems in which observation, ritual, and practical action were inseparable, embedding ecological intelligence within symbolic frameworks. Trade and interaction networks amplified the development of proto-religion. As groups engaged in exchange, ideas about cosmology, ritual practice, and sacred symbolism spread across regions. Stories, myths, and ceremonial knowledge traveled alongside material goods, allowing belief systems to evolve, merge, and diversify. Exposure to different practices encouraged reinterpretation and adaptation, fostering innovation in spiritual thought. Humans were learning to negotiate shared meaning across cultural boundaries, balancing local identity with broader interaction, and integrating external knowledge into communal cosmologies. Emotional and psychological dimensions were deeply entwined with early religious practice. Humans experienced awe, fear, gratitude, hope, and anticipation as they engaged with the unseen or the sacred. Ritual and symbolic acts provided a structured outlet for these emotions, transforming anxiety and uncertainty into shared experience, moral guidance, and social cohesion. The act of participating in ceremonies reinforced belonging, ethical responsibility, and cognitive focus. Humans were developing emotional intelligence in parallel with social, technological, and cognitive capacities, integrating feeling, imagination, and action in ways that strengthened both community and individual resilience. Mortality and the human life cycle were central themes in early spiritual systems. Humans confronted death, disease, and environmental unpredictability, and they sought frameworks to understand, mitigate, or ritualize these realities. Burial practices, offerings, and symbolic markers reflect beliefs about the afterlife, ancestral presence, and continuity of community across generations. These practices reinforced intergenerational memory, transmitting moral and practical lessons embedded within ritual forms. Humans were linking temporal understanding with ethical action, recognizing the consequences of behavior not just for themselves, but for descendants and the community at large. Cultural innovation emerged in tandem with proto-religion. The codification of ritual practices, symbolic motifs, and moral narratives stimulated creativity, planning, and technical refinement. Ceremonial structures, altars, and designated ritual spaces required architectural knowledge, coordination, and labor management. These innovations intertwined social, technological, and cognitive skills, fostering complex project execution and reinforcing the community's capacity for foresight and cooperation. Spiritual practice thus catalyzed the integration of multiple domains of human skill, producing cumulative cultural evolution that extended far beyond immediate survival imperatives. The development of proto-religion also encouraged ethical and social regulation. Belief in unseen forces or the moral significance of actions created frameworks for cooperation, reciprocity, and fairness. Ritualized enforcement of taboos, sacred obligations, and moral norms promoted group cohesion, mitigated conflict, and reinforced social identity. Humans were experimenting with abstract ethical systems, linking spiritual belief to practical governance and interpersonal conduct. In doing so, proto-religion became a powerful mechanism for social integration, enabling larger, more complex communities to function effectively and sustainably. Cognitive, emotional, and social capacities were further enhanced through the performance of ritual. Humans had to remember sequences of action, coordinate timing, and maintain attention while integrating symbolic meaning. The immersive nature of ceremony cultivated memory, focus, and collective consciousness. By engaging in structured symbolic activity, humans were practicing foresight, planning, and abstraction, training the mind to navigate complexity and interdependence. Ritual was simultaneously a rehearsal for cognitive skill, emotional regulation, and social coordination. Through these intertwined processes, proto-religion shaped the trajectory of human civilization. It provided frameworks for understanding the natural world, structuring social life, and encoding cumulative knowledge. It reinforced cooperation, ethical behavior, and shared identity, while fostering imagination, abstraction, and long-term planning. Communities that successfully integrated spiritual, ecological, and social awareness could sustain larger populations, coordinate labor-intensive projects, and transmit knowledge across generations. Proto-religion thus functioned as both a cultural adhesive and a cognitive catalyst, preparing humans for the complexity, innovation, and social scale that would define later urban civilizations. By tracing the emergence of proto-religion, we see that humans were negotiating existence in both material and immaterial realms. They were embedding morality, cosmology, and social order into the fabric of daily life, using ritual, symbols, and shared belief to guide behavior and shape perception. Humans were learning to conceptualize forces beyond immediate sensory experience, anticipate outcomes across time, and coordinate collective action at unprecedented scales. These spiritual innovations, emerging tens of thousands of years before the cities of Sumer, laid the cognitive, social, and moral foundations for civilization itself, demonstrating that the human mind was as much a builder of ideas and meaning as it was of tools, settlements, and infrastructure.